It began with a sense of familiarity where there shouldn't be any. I was in line at the grocery store, half listening to the cashier joke with the guy ahead of me, when I caught myself mouthing the exact words he was saying as he said them. Not something you could predict either. A specific joke about how Wednesday is just Monday with better lighting. I'd never seen that cashier before in my life, and I'd never heard that joke. It felt like deja vu on steroids, a memory from nowhere. But maybe it was a fluke. That's what I thought until I got home and noticed other little things. Barely worth mentioning, really. My keys weren't where I remembered putting them. The lamp by the couch was turned a few inches to the left, and when I went to turn off the kitchen light, my hand hesitated. The switch felt wrong somehow, like it was in the wrong place. It was subtle enough that I could brush it off, so I did, except the feeling didn't go away. It kept happening in these tiny ways, and after a while, it was impossible to ignore. The worst was one night, about a week into all this, when I woke up on the couch with the TV blaring. The screen was nothing but static, like it had lost the signal, but I don't remember even turning it on, let alone changing it to a channel with nothing on it. The remote was on the floor, but when I reached for it, I felt a pinch on my hand like I put it right in the path of a mousetrap. Nothing was there, just the remote, cold to the touch, too cold. I brushed it off as sleepwalking and tried to laugh it away. But even as I sat in bed trying to get back to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that the static had been whispering. A couple of days later, I got a call from my sister. She asked me how the new job was going. I was confused. Same job I'd had for years, as far as I knew. I asked her if she'd gotten me mixed up with someone else, but she laughed, telling me she was just teasing. She said she knew it was a big change for me, starting somewhere new. But I wasn't sure what to say because it was so far from the truth that it caught me off guard. I told her it was going fine, thinking maybe I'd mentioned something in a text or on a call I didn't remember, and she'd twisted it around in her head. I mean, who doesn't lose track of small details sometimes? But from then on, other people started bringing up things I'd never said or done. My coworkers congratulated me on new projects I'd supposedly started. My landlord asked about a new desk he'd seen me carrying in. I hadn't bought one. And an old friend reached out, asking if I was really moving to the city. It felt like my life was split in two, with everyone around me living in a version of it that I couldn't see. I kept going back to texts and emails, looking for any mention of these things I'd apparently told people. There was nothing there, just silence, as if the conversations had happened without my knowledge. A few nights later, I tried to stay up, wanted to see if I could catch myself in the act of whatever was happening when I wasn't me. Midnight came and went. Nothing. I was almost relieved, settling into the quiet darkness, wondering if it really was all in my head. But around 3 a.m., as I lay on the edge of sleep, my phone lit up. I had a message for myself. Tomorrow's the day, it read. Don't pretend you don't know. I felt my skin go cold. I checked my phone log, then my sent messages, but there was nothing there. Nothing to suggest I'd ever typed that, yet it was there, lingering on my screen. When I tried to respond, the message vanished, disappearing from the screen as if it had never been sent. The next morning, I woke up to find an envelope on my kitchen table. It was stamped and addressed to an apartment in a city 2 hours away. Inside was a letter, written in my handwriting, but I had no memory of writing it. "Hello," it began. "This is the version of me that you're not supposed to know about. I've been making changes, finding new ways to fit, and tomorrow's the day you finally see what I've become." I kept rereading the letter, trying to make sense of it. The words were just words, but they carried this eerie weight, like they were a message from a part of me I didn't recognize. The handwriting was mine, but shakier, like it had been written in a hurry, under some kind of pressure. I wanted to throw the letter away, forget I'd ever seen it, but something in me couldn't let it go. That night, I went to bed feeling like I was waiting for something. I drifted in and out of sleep, kept half awake by the feeling of someone watching me, even though I was alone. Around 2 a.m., I sat up, heart pounding, and stared into the dark. I could swear there was someone else in the room, just out of sight. I felt a weight on my chest, a pressure that wasn't my own, and then I heard a voice. It wasn't loud, barely more than a whisper, but it came from inside my head, like a thought I hadn't chosen to think. "You've done well to make it this far," it said, and the voice sounded so much like mine that it made me shudder. but I need you to stop resisting now." My own mouth moved, and I realized, with a shock that made my skin crawl, that I hadn't chosen to speak. "Who are you?" I heard myself say, the words spilling out hollow and flat. "Don't worry about that," it replied, calm and smooth, echoing like it was bouncing around the inside of my skull. "I've been part of you for a long time, and tomorrow I'll be taking over." I felt my body tense, as though I were being puppeted from the inside, my limbs no longer under my own control. The next morning, I woke up in my bed, sunlight streaming through the window, and I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. Everything was back to normal, or so I thought. I looked around the room and realized, in the clear light of day, that everything was wrong. My belongings were all there, but they'd been rearranged. The clock on my nightstand read a time that didn't make sense, and my phone, once locked with my fingerprint, now unlocked to a new passcode I didn't remember setting. I had a message in my inbox, one I couldn't explain. "Congratulations," it read, "we've finally made the switch." The person in my phone photos looked like me, but wasn't me. The clothes were mine, the smile was mine, but the eyes were wrong, empty. I stared at the screen in horror, a cold realization settling in. Whatever had been watching me, controlling me in those empty moments, had finished whatever it was doing. I was still here, but somehow I'd been pushed aside, a passenger in my own life. As I watched, the new me in the photo winked, as if it knew I was watching, and then the image went blank. That was 2 weeks ago. I've tried reaching out, trying to tell people what happened, but no one responds anymore, like I've faded to static, some forgotten signal drifting off into nowhere. And I still wake up in my bed each morning, but my days and nights aren't mine anymore. I go through the motions, but I know I'm only watching now, waiting, always on the outside, with a version of myself that won't let me back in. I may still be here, but I'm not in control, and somehow I know I never will be again. It started on a Tuesday, a perfectly ordinary day, except for the single phone call from an unknown number. I don't usually answer them, but for some reason, I picked up. No one spoke on the other end, just a soft, faint buzzing, like an old radio stuck between stations. I waited a few seconds, said hello once more, then hung up. The call lingered in my mind all day, though. It was unsettling. Not the kind of unsettling where you expect a rational explanation, but the kind that makes you feel something's off without knowing why. That night, I came home late. As I dropped my keys on the counter, I noticed my kitchen chair was pulled out slightly from the table. It's the kind of thing you might brush off as forgetfulness, but I knew I hadn't left it like that. It didn't feel like my space. And as I went through the evening, little things started to seem altered. A pen I could have sworn I'd left on the coffee table was lying on the floor across the room. The picture frames on the wall hung just a degree or two askew, barely noticeable, but enough that something inside me sensed a shift. I chalked it up to exhaustion and went to bed, but I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing a soft rustling sound, like someone shuffling just out of sight. I got up, checked the apartment, but everything was as it should be, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator. So I went back to bed, willing myself to ignore the sounds, until I finally drifted off. The next morning, I woke up and noticed my closet door was slightly open. I know for a fact that I'd closed it the night before. I hesitated, staring into the sliver of darkness beyond the door's edge. I stepped closer, holding my breath, half expecting to see what? I didn't know. Just the usual shadows playing tricks. When I opened it wider, there was nothing. Everything was in its place, but a faint scent lingered in the air. Something metallic, a smell that sent chills crawling up my spine. Later, I noticed my phone had received another call from that same unknown number. I didn't answer it this time, but a voicemail had been left. I clicked play, half expecting more buzzing, but instead, I heard a faint voice, crackling and distorted, whispering one single phrase. "Stop looking." I shivered, my mind racing. Was this some prank? I replayed the message, trying to catch the voice clearly, but it was distant, almost muffled, like someone speaking from the other side of a wall. I didn't want to admit it, but I felt watched. I could feel a presence around me, like there was something just outside my field of vision, something barely there lurking. Over the next few days, the disturbances grew. I'd find my shoes placed in odd places, or feel a rush of cold air without any windows open. One night, my bedroom door creaked open by itself as I was falling asleep. It was slow, deliberate, the way it moved, and I sat up, heart pounding. I called out, telling myself it was just a breeze or the way the apartment settled. But no explanation could comfort me. On Friday, as I was brushing my teeth, I glanced up at the mirror and froze. For a second, a split second, I thought I saw a face, pale and expressionless, standing behind me in the reflection. I whipped around, but the room was empty. I stared at my own reflection, breath shallow, trying to convince myself I hadn't just seen what I thought I did. But it felt real, horribly, chillingly real. I started avoiding my apartment, staying late at work, going out with friends, anything to keep me away. But every time I came home, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, like something was waiting for me. The calls became more frequent, but I stopped listening to the voicemails. I'd feel my phone buzz and dread would settle in my stomach. Then, one night, I came home and found a single note lying on my kitchen counter. The paper was thin, almost translucent, and the words were scrawled in rough, jagged letters. I said, "Stop looking." I tore through my apartment, checking windows, the locks on my doors. But everything was secure. The windows hadn't been forced, and the door was locked just as I'd left it. Yet somehow someone had been inside. I tossed the note in the trash, washed my hands like it would somehow cleanse the anxiety crawling under my skin, and went to bed. I lay there, eyes wide open, heart pounding, waiting for something to happen. That night, I woke to the feeling of someone watching me. I opened my eyes, and my heart stopped. Standing in the doorway, barely visible in the faint light, was a figure. Tall, motionless, its face obscured in darkness. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there. I couldn't scream, couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. My body was paralyzed with terror. I closed my eyes, convinced I was dreaming, but when I opened them, it was still there, looming, silent, like it was waiting for me to acknowledge it. And then just as suddenly, it was gone. The next day, I moved out. I didn't explain anything to the landlord, didn't even tell my friends the full story. I just packed my things and left as quickly as I could, moving into a new place across the city. For a few weeks, everything seemed normal. The calls stopped. The strange occurrences faded into memory. I felt the tension in my body finally start to relax. But one night, as I was unpacking some old boxes, I found something that stopped me cold. There, lying at the bottom of a box, was that same thin, translucent piece of paper. And scrawled on it in those same jagged letters were 3 words: "I'm still here." I dropped the note, hands shaking, trying to make sense of it. How had it followed me? I'd left it behind, left that apartment, left everything there. But the note, no, it couldn't be real. I stepped back, breathing hard, telling myself that it was impossible. I threw the note away again, locked my doors, and lay in bed, my mind racing. I woke in the middle of the night to a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from just outside my bedroom door. It was slow, measured, almost like footsteps. I lay there, paralyzed, feeling the presence outside my door, its weight, its intent. It was here, whatever it was, waiting for me. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, staring at the crack beneath my door, half expecting to see shadows move, half expecting to hear the door creak open. When dawn finally broke, the tapping stopped, but I knew it hadn't left. And now, every night, as I lie in bed, I hear it. The slow, soft tapping pacing outside my door. The first time I saw him, I didn't think much of it. I was getting home late, around 1 a.m., and noticed a man standing on the corner near my apartment building. He was half in shadow, wearing a long, dark coat that brushed the tops of his shoes, and he just stood there, facing my way, but not looking at me. I remember thinking he was waiting for someone, or had maybe wandered off from one of the nearby bars and was taking a smoke break. It was only when I walked past him to get to my door that I felt a strange chill crawl up my spine. It wasn't even that he did anything. He didn't speak or look at me, and that was the part that felt wrong. Like he was there, standing still as stone, just observing, though I couldn't tell what. When I got inside, I looked back out the window to see if he was still there, but he disappeared. For the next week or so, I forgot about him. Life was busy, my job kept me late, and by the time I got home most nights, I was too tired to think much of anything besides collapsing in bed. But one night, I was heading back around midnight and found myself looking for him as I walked up my street. The same corner, the same dark coat. It was like he had never left. This time, he was facing me fully, just barely visible under the dim street lamp. I felt my heart quicken and my feet hesitated, but I told myself I was being paranoid. I hurried past, not daring to look back. I felt his eyes boring into me the entire way to my door. The nights that followed, he started showing up at different spots on my street and always just out of my line of sight until I was close enough for it to be jarring. Sometimes he was across the street, standing perfectly still, always half hidden by something, the edge of a car or tree. Once, he was in the little alleyway right next to my building, half of his face hidden in shadow, eyes wide and empty of any hint of friendliness. I called my friend Amy to tell her about it, and she brushed it off, said I was just stressed from work and that it was probably just a guy who hung around the neighborhood, maybe even someone who lived nearby. I agreed just to brush off the worry, but part of me knew it wasn't that simple. One night, it got worse. I had gotten home unusually early, around 8 p.m., and was carrying my groceries up the steps. I pushed my door open, arms full of bags, and flicked on the lights. I almost dropped everything. There on my dining room table was a photo, an actual printed photo. It was a picture of me, taken from behind as I was walking down the street. I felt my stomach churn, and I froze, staring at the image. My hands shook as I picked it up, and I could feel cold sweat dripping down the back of my neck. In the picture, I was only a few blocks from my apartment, completely unaware that someone had been right there, close enough to take my picture. In the bottom corner of the photo, written in black ink, was a single word: wait. I stumbled backward, dropping the photo, and sprinted out of my apartment, locking the door behind me. My heart raced as I pounded on my neighbor's door, begging for someone to answer. Luckily, Mrs. Garcia from across the hall opened her door, and I quickly explained, stammering over my words. She took pity on me and let me stay with her while we called the police. They arrived, took my statement, and searched the apartment, but didn't find anything. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, no fingerprints. They suggested it could have been a prank, maybe even by someone I knew, but the look in their eyes told me they didn't believe that any more than I did. I slept on Mrs. Garcia's couch that night, and the next day, I took the first chance I got to look for a new place to live. My lease wasn't up for another 3 months, but I was ready to lose the deposit if it meant getting out. I spent the next few days trying to arrange a sublet, barely eating or sleeping. Every time I walked to or from work, I felt like he was there, lurking just out of sight, watching me. I jumped at every shadow, every person who passed by. 2 nights before I was supposed to move, I was woken up by a loud creaking noise from my front door. I lay in bed, paralyzed, the adrenaline pumping through me as I strained to hear. It was the sound of someone shifting their weight, like they were pressing against the door from the outside. I slowly slid out of bed, trying not to make any noise, and crawled to the door, barely breathing. I was afraid to look through the peephole, but I had to know. I couldn't take this feeling of being hunted anymore. I leaned forward just enough to peek. My entire body went cold. There he was, inches from my door, staring straight into the peephole like he knew I was watching. I don't think I've ever been that close to someone and seen so little humanity in their eyes. They were dark, hollow, and empty, as if he was just a shell of a person. He raised a hand slowly, the edges of his fingers disappearing into the shadows around him, and tapped twice, lightly, on the door. Then he whispered, just loud enough for me to hear, soon. I couldn't move. I stayed frozen there for what felt like hours, listening as his footsteps finally faded down the hall. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. As soon as the sun rose, I packed whatever I could carry and got out. I left everything else behind. I managed to move out that day, and for weeks, I stayed with a friend, constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for him to show up. But he didn't. It was as if he had vanished along with my things. I told myself he was gone, that it was over. 3 months later, I felt brave enough to go back to my old building to pick up my mail. The landlord had set it aside for me, and I planned to be in and out within minutes. When I got there, the building felt different, almost peaceful, like the dark weight that had been there was lifted. I exchanged some small talk with the landlord, trying to hide my nerves, and headed out. As I reached the front door, he called after me. "By the way," he said casually, "some guy stopped by looking for you. Said he was a friend, asked if you still lived here. When I told him you'd moved, he left this note." He handed me a small slip of paper, folded neatly. My stomach twisted as I took it, knowing exactly what I'd see before I even opened it. Inside, in that same handwriting from the photo, were 2 words: "Found you." I dropped the note and ran, barely even hearing the landlord calling after me. To this day, I still don't know who he was, what he wanted, or why he stopped following me for a while just to reappear when I thought it was safe. But even now, in crowded places, I feel those hollow eyes somewhere in the distance, watching, waiting, like he's always one step behind me, just waiting for me to look back. And I know, one day, he'll be there, standing just close enough to whisper that word again soon. It started out as just another drive back from my parents' place. A familiar, well-worn 2-hour stretch through mostly forested back roads, empty fields, and the occasional broken-down gas station. The sun was setting, bathing everything in an orangey-pink glow, and for once, traffic was sparse. I was on autopilot, already mentally settling back into my own apartment, my own bed, and maybe a late-night snack if I could resist the pull of sleep long enough. That's when I saw him. A man standing by the side of the road, thumb out, dressed in a thin, frayed windbreaker and holding a black trash bag. At first, I barely noticed him, but as my headlights swept over him, he turned to look at me, eyes intense and fixed right on mine as I drove past. My stomach twisted, instinct kicking in. Something about his face was wrong. It was the look in his eyes, dark, empty, like he wasn't really seeing me, just my car. I kept driving, telling myself I'd made the right decision. It was getting late, and picking up strangers on an empty stretch of road just wasn't smart. But a few miles later, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he was still somehow watching me. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him back there, but the road was empty. Just the endless stretch of trees, fading into darkness as the sun disappeared. About 20 minutes later, I stopped at a gas station on the edge of the next small town to fill up. The place was empty except for an old clerk behind the counter who looked up as I walked in, giving me a nod before returning to his newspaper. I took my time, wandering down the aisles to shake off the weird encounter, picking up a snack and a soda. When I returned to the counter, the clerk was watching me intently, his eyes narrowed. "You're heading east, aren't you?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. I frowned. "Yeah, how'd you know?" The clerk shrugged, leaning closer. "Just be careful. Saw you come in, thought I should say it. You see anything weird out there, just keep driving. Don't stop." He didn't elaborate, and as I paid and walked back out to my car, I tried to laugh it off. Creepy old guys at rundown gas stations telling spooky stories. It sounded like the start of a horror movie. But that same uneasy feeling stuck with me. I shook it off, got back on the road, and everything seemed fine for the next hour. But the closer I got to my town, the more it started to rain. A light drizzle at first, then heavier until it was a torrential downpour. My wipers were going full speed, barely keeping up with the sheets of water hitting my windshield. I squinted into the rain, my visibility almost zero. That's when I saw it. Another figure standing by the side of the road, arm raised, thumb out, soaked through but unmistakable. It was the same man. A chill ran down my spine. There was no way he could have gotten this far ahead of me. I'd seen no other cars, and he hadn't had time to hitch a ride from someone else. And yet, here he was, staring right at me as I passed. His expression was the same, cold, emotionless, almost hungry. I sped up, my heart pounding as I left him behind, praying I wouldn't see him again. I told myself it was just a coincidence, maybe someone who looked similar, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. Minutes later, my phone buzzed with a text notification. I grabbed it at a stop sign, hoping for a distraction, maybe a message from a friend or an email. Instead, it was a single text from an unknown number. "You left me behind." I stared at the screen, my stomach dropping. I hadn't given anyone my number recently, and I hadn't picked anyone up. The hair on the back of my neck prickled, and I shoved the phone away, trying to convince myself it was just a prank. The rain had slowed a little, and I focused on the road, counting the miles until I'd be home. I was almost back in my own neighborhood, passing a familiar field, when I saw him again, standing by the road, drenched and shivering, with that same trash bag in his hand. This time, I couldn't convince myself it was someone else. It was him, same hollow eyes, same expressionless face, but his clothes were torn, hanging off him in wet, muddy strips. His mouth opened wide, and I swear I saw him mouth my name. I pressed the gas pedal to the floor, speeding past him, my hands gripping the wheel, so tightly my knuckles turned white. I didn't dare look back, didn't even check the mirrors. All I wanted was to get home, to lock my door, to pretend this never happened. Finally, I pulled into my driveway, practically jumping out of the car and running to my front door. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to get the door unlocked. Once inside, I locked it, bolted it, and went around making sure every window, every other door was secure. I collapsed onto my couch, trying to calm myself, breathing in and out, reassuring myself that he couldn't have followed me here. It was impossible. Just as I started to relax, there was a knock on the door. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The knock came again, louder this time. I forced myself to get up, creeping toward the door and looking through the peephole. The porch light flickered, casting strange shadows across the figure standing there, but it was unmistakably him. The same man from the road, drenched, his face twisted in a strange, pleading expression. He raised a hand, pressed it against the door, and I could hear his muffled voice through the wood. "You left me," he said, his tone soft but unmistakably angry. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. How had he followed me? I'd driven for miles, taken turns, lost him in the rain. This wasn't possible. I pulled out my phone, intending to call the police, but before I could even dial, I heard the sound of footsteps moving around the side of the house. He was walking along the windows, his hand tapping each one as he went. Tap, top, top. My heart raced as I tried to keep track of where he was, moving from room to stay out of sight. But then the tapping stopped and there was silence. I held my breath, hoping he'd given up, that maybe he'd moved on. But then I heard it, the faint sound of my back door creaking open. I don't know why, but I moved closer, inching toward the kitchen where the back door led. The lights were off, and as I peered around the corner, I saw him standing there, dripping wet, his back turned to me. He was holding that black trash bag, and he was mumbling something under his breath, words I couldn't quite make out. I froze, every instinct telling me not to move, not to make a sound. But as I stood there, one word he muttered became clear. My name. Over and over, he whispered it, his voice low and raspy, like he was trying to summon me. Suddenly, he stopped, turning his head slightly as if he'd sensed me. I ducked behind the counter, my breath shallow, my hands shaking. I could hear him moving, his footsteps slow and deliberate, coming closer. I stayed as still as I could, barely daring to breathe, praying he wouldn't find me. Then, the footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. Finally, I gathered the courage to look, peeking over the edge of the counter. The kitchen was empty. The back door was closed. It was as if he'd never been there at all. But when I got to my feet, heart pounding, I noticed the black trash bag lying on the floor in front of the door. I approached it slowly, my hand trembling as I reached out to open it. Inside was something small and metallic, shining faintly in the dim light. I pulled it out, feeling the cold weight of it in my hand. It was my own spare house. The unraveling started one Sunday afternoon. The leaves outside were turning, and I'd been excited about a lazy day in, just me and Jess. We planned to bake something elaborate, like those tiny tartlets she always pointed out in bakery windows. But the whole idea fell flat when she suddenly said she was meeting friends from college. It wasn't like her to ditch our plans at the last minute, but I just shrugged it off. As I was tidying up, her phone buzzed on the counter. Now, I'm not one to snoop, and I'd never felt the need before. But that afternoon, as the phone kept lighting up, something gnawed at me. It wasn't like Jess to leave her phone lying around. I found myself glancing over, just as a preview flashed across the screen. Last night was wow. It read, followed by a winking emoji. My stomach twisted, but I convinced myself it was probably a friend being weirdly expressive about a joke or something. I forced myself to put the phone back, acting like I hadn't seen it, but my mind was racing. The next couple of days felt surreal, almost like I was living in two separate worlds. The one where everything was fine, and the one where something was very, very wrong. Every little thing Jess did took on new meaning. I'd see her glancing at her phone more often, smiling at texts she wouldn't let me see, talking about work colleagues I'd never heard of. And then she got distant. She didn't look at me quite the same, didn't laugh as much when I made jokes, didn't reach for my hand in those automatic ways she always used to. It wasn't until a few weeks later, when she left her laptop open on our coffee table, that I let myself take a closer look. The screen was filled with emails, dozens of them from some name I didn't recognize, each with inside jokes, late-night plans, shared secrets. As I read through them, the room seemed to close in around me, every word confirming what I hadn't wanted to believe. They were talking about how they kept things a secret, how their time together felt forbidden, exhilarating. Jess was cheating, and I was reading the proof right there, on our couch. I didn't say anything at first. I think I was in shock, trying to process how the person I trusted most had this whole other life that didn't include me. Days turned into weeks, and I couldn't bring myself to confront her. I started watching her, waiting for some sign that she'd come clean, that she'd tell me on her own, but every day she'd just smile and act like nothing had changed. One night, I decided to follow her. She'd said she was meeting some friends for a book club thing, but I'd seen her put on makeup I hadn't seen in months and perfume she used to only wear on special occasions. So I waited a few minutes after she left and slipped out to follow her. She drove across town to this little cafe that was dimly lit, trendy in a way Jess usually rolled her eyes at. She went inside, and I followed, keeping my distance but close enough to see her sit down with a guy. Him, the one from the emails. They laughed, leaning in close, their heads almost touching. I felt my face flush, my hands shaking. It was strange, feeling like an intruder in my own life, watching the woman I'd loved so deeply, trusted so completely, with someone else. The waiter passed by, glancing at me as if I was the one out of place. Maybe I was. I watched as they held hands across the table, their fingers intertwining. I knew Jess's hands by heart, the softness, the tiny freckle on her wrist, and seeing them it just felt like a punch to the gut. I went back to the car, sat there with my head against the steering wheel, feeling like my chest was hollow. I didn't know what to do, didn't even know what I felt at that point. Anger, betrayal, sadness, maybe all of it at once. When I got home, I sat in the dark for hours, trying to piece together how we'd gotten here, how someone who once told me I was their whole world could turn away so completely. I finally confronted her the next morning. She came into the kitchen, still half asleep, and I just blurted it out. "Who's he, Jess?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. She looked up, startled, like a kid caught sneaking out past curfew. And for a second, I thought I saw a guilt flash across her face. But then she sighed, looked away, and muttered, "I was going to tell you. I just didn't know how." Her words were hollow, almost rehearsed, as if she'd been preparing for this moment, but never quite believed it would happen. I couldn't hear anything after that. She was saying something about feeling disconnected, about how things had changed between us, but all I could focus on was how cold and distant she seemed, as if I were a stranger standing in her kitchen. She'd already moved on, even if she hadn't told me yet. We spent the next few days avoiding each other, trapped in a strange, silent dance. I kept telling myself I could forgive her, that we could work through this, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw them together, laughing, holding hands like they were in love. I realized I was trying to hold on to a version of Jess that didn't exist anymore. The girl I'd loved was gone, replaced by someone who could lie to my face every day without a second thought. She moved out a month later, leaving behind a few boxes of stuff she'd come back for later, but I knew she never would. The apartment felt emptier without her things scattered around, but there was a strange kind of relief in that emptiness, too. I didn't have to pretend anymore, didn't have to keep lying to myself. I'd lost her, but maybe I'd found something else in the process, myself, or at least what was left of me. Sometimes, late at night, I still wonder if I could have done something differently, if I could have been better, tried harder, loved her more. But those thoughts are quieter now, fading a little each day. Life keeps moving, whether you're ready or not. It's strange to think how easily love can unravel, how something that felt so certain, so permanent, can just slip away, leaving you alone to pick up the pieces. I was 19, in my first apartment, and loving the freedom. My place was on the outskirts of town, down a half-paved road that barely saw traffic. It was old, one of those buildings with creaky floors and single-paned windows that shook whenever the wind blew hard enough. My parents didn't like me living so far from campus, but the price was right, and to me it felt charming. Quiet, cozy, and just a little bit spooky, the perfect first place. The first weird thing that happened was the door. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard the soft click of it opening. My heart skipped a beat, but then I thought I must have just left it ajar and the draft from the windows made it swing open. I'd forgotten to lock it a few times, so I got up to close and lock it before drifting back to sleep. But the next morning, the door was open again. Not just unlocked, but wide open. I'm a light sleeper, so if anyone had come in, I would have heard it. Still, I checked every inch of the place, half expecting to find someone hiding in a closet or behind the curtains. No one. I locked the door again and chalked it up to my own carelessness. Maybe I hadn't latched it properly. Old locks were finicky like that. But every night it kept happening. I'd lock the door, go to bed, and by morning it would be standing wide open. The odd thing was that nothing was ever missing, and there were no signs of forced entry. I felt watched, but I kept convincing myself it was just paranoia. After all, I just moved in, and the apartment was old, prone to drafts and rattling noises. That's what I kept telling myself. After a week of this, I started propping a chair under the doorknob. It was the kind of chair with wooden legs that would make a terrible scraping sound if anyone tried to push it aside. I figured if someone was coming in, I'd hear them. But that first night with the chair in place, I woke up around 3 in the morning to silence, complete silence. The usual hum of the old radiator, the occasional creak from the floorboards, even the sound of the wind outside. All of it was gone. It was like the air itself had stopped moving. That's when I heard a shuffling sound, almost like something was sliding across the floor. It was coming from my living room. I sat up in bed, straining to hear more. The shuffle was faint, dragging along like someone shuffling in a heavy coat or dragging something on the ground. I told myself it was nothing. I was just being paranoid. But then I heard it again, closer, this time right outside my bedroom door. I forced myself out of bed, trembling, and inched toward the bedroom door. My phone was on the other side of the room, on the charger. I thought about grabbing it, calling someone, but I was too scared to make a sound. So instead, I pressed my ear to the door, trying to listen. It was faint, but I heard breathing, just on the other side, like someone standing there waiting. And then a light tap on the door. Not a knock, just a gentle tap, as if someone were checking to see if I was there. I backed away, heart hammering, and grabbed the first thing I could find, a metal flashlight from my nightstand. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stood there, clutching the flashlight and staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. After a few minutes of absolute silence, I finally got the courage to swing the door open. Nothing. My apartment was empty, the front door still latched with the chair underneath it. I went through every room, opening closets, looking under the bed, even checking the cabinets in the kitchen. Nothing. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself I must have been half asleep and imagining it. But the next night, it got worse. I went to bed, too afraid to even close my eyes, but exhaustion took over, and at some point I drifted off. I woke up again at 3, jolted out of sleep by that same dead silence. And then, from somewhere deep in the shadows, I heard someone whisper, "Hello." It was faint, but unmistakable. A woman's voice, low and trembling. I sat up, heart pounding. I could hear my own breathing, sharp and panicked. But the whisper came again, softer this time. "Hello, are you there?" I held my breath. The voice sounded like it was coming from the wall. My bed was pushed up against the wall, so I leaned my ear closer, straining to hear anything more. Then, so close it felt like it was coming from right beside my ear, the whisper came again, clearer than before. "Help me." I scrambled off the bed, stumbling backward, heart hammering in my chest. I turned on every light in the apartment, convinced someone had to be inside the walls. I knocked, tapped on the plaster, shouted to see if someone would respond. Silence. No answer. And the whispering had stopped. I was wide awake now, scared out of my mind. I knew I should leave, call someone, but I was too scared to even step out the front door. I stayed up until dawn, pacing the living room, every little sound making my skin crawl. In the daylight, I tried to convince myself that it had been a dream. But that night, I pushed my bed away from the wall and slept with the lights on. The whispering didn't stop. Every night, like clockwork, it would start around 3 a.m., a soft, sad voice coming from the walls, calling out for help. It started getting clearer, more desperate, like whoever or whatever was inside the wall was struggling, trapped, pleading for someone to hear. I tried to ignore it, try not to answer, but it kept going, getting louder every night. Finally, after a week of this, I couldn't take it anymore. I went to my landlord who lived in the building and told him everything. He looked at me like I was crazy, but I begged him to check the walls to see if maybe there was some old pipe or speaker or anything that could be causing the sound. He hesitated, then sighed and agreed to take a look. Together, we peeled back the wallpaper near where I'd heard the voice. At first, there was nothing but the usual drywall and insulation, but then, behind a patch of crumbling plaster, we found something else. A small, narrow gap, no more than a foot wide. Just enough space for something to slip through. And inside, there was a faded piece of cloth, tucked between the insulation, as though someone had reached in from behind the wall and left it there. It looked like an old dress, stained and dusty. And pinned to it, an old photograph, yellowed and faded. It was of a woman, her face blurred, but she was staring directly at the camera, her eyes dark and hollow. My landlord looked as pale as I felt. He muttered something about old stories and quickly sealed up the wall again, refusing to talk about it. I moved out the following week, too afraid to stay another night. Sometimes I wonder about that photograph, about the woman in the dress. I still hear her voice sometimes, faint and pleading, just as I'm falling asleep. I try to convince myself it's just an echo in my mind, a leftover fear from that horrible apartment. But there are nights when I wake up, feeling watched, and I swear I hear her, faint and distant, calling out from some dark, hidden place, as if she never left. When I signed up for that dog-sitting gig, I didn't expect anything beyond a bit of quick cash. The owners, an elderly couple, were going on a cruise and needed someone to stay in their house for a week to watch their golden retriever, Max. Their home was one of those old Victorian-style houses, the kind you see on postcards, with ivy creeping up the walls and a heavy, slightly eerie silence that filled every corner. The first night went fine. Max was a sweetheart, big, dopey, with a graying muzzle and a wagging tail. We curled up on the couch together, and by the time I was ready to turn in, I felt perfectly comfortable. I turned off the lights, double-checked the locks, and went up to the guest room, where a big old bed and an antique wardrobe loomed like silent sentinels. There was an odd smell, a faint sour scent, but I figured it was just the age of the place. I was almost asleep when I heard a soft creaking sound from downstairs. I brushed it off as the house settling. It was an old structure, after all. But then I heard the click of what sounded like nails on hardwood, slowly moving around the living room. I told myself it was just Max, wandering around, maybe restless in his old age. Still, I found myself listening closely, following the sound as it moved room to room, almost deliberately. But when I glanced over, I could see Max lying by my bed, fast asleep. The sound stopped abruptly, right outside my door. I lay there, heart pounding, barely breathing, waiting for something to happen. Minutes passed, and eventually, I convinced myself I'd imagined it, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. I fell asleep again, but with an uneasy feeling I couldn't shake. The next morning, I noticed something strange. The door to the basement, which I was sure had been closed, was slightly ajar. The basement had been off limits. The couple had mentioned it was just storage and clutter, and I didn't need to go down there for any reason. But the door was definitely open, and I could have sworn I'd seen something shift in the shadows as I walked by. I decided to leave it alone, closing it firmly and going about my day. That night, the sound started up again, this time louder, like something heavy was being dragged across the floorboards. I lay frozen in bed, gripping the sheets, watching Max, who was now wide awake, his ears perked, head turned toward the door. His hackles were up, and he stared with intense focus, growling low in his throat. I sat up slowly, feeling a chill settle over me, and finally dared to open the bedroom door, just a crack. The hallway was dark, but I could just make out the faint outline of something at the other end. It was crouched low, almost touching the floor, and it looked wrong, like a figure in the shape of a person but too thin, its limbs stretched and elongated like they were made of paper. I slammed the door shut, heart hammering, and locked it. For hours, Max and I stayed there, listening as the dragging sound moved around, sometimes closer, sometimes retreating, until it faded completely around dawn. When morning finally came, I tiptoed out to check the house. Everything looked normal, and I almost convinced myself it had been a nightmare. But then I saw it, a set of faint, muddy footprints leading from the basement door, trailing along the floor and stopping just outside my bedroom. The footprints were too large for a dog's, yet oddly misshapen, like someone had been walking on the very tips of their fingers and toes. I wanted to leave, but I'd made a promise to stay. I tried calling the couple, but their phone kept going to voicemail. In a panic, I finally left a message, asking if they'd ever noticed anything strange, but I didn't get a reply. That night, the sounds began even earlier. As soon as the house fell quiet, I heard it, the slow, deliberate scraping and dragging. This time, it was coming from directly beneath me, down in the basement. I could almost picture it, a figure slithering across the cold, stone floor, scratching its way up the stairs. Max started growling again, his body tense, his gaze fixed on the door. I was too scared to move, barely even breathing as the sound grew closer, the creaking of the stairs growing louder with each step. Just as I thought it might reach the door, the sound suddenly stopped. I held my breath, listening to the silence, straining to hear any hint of movement. And then a soft knock, 3 slow, measured taps on the other side of the door. I stayed like that, frozen, until the first light of dawn finally trickled in through the window. When I checked outside the door, I found something waiting for me, an old, rusted key lying on the floor directly in front of my room. I picked it up, heart pounding, and turned it over in my hand. It looked ancient, the kind of thing you'd find in a museum, with intricate designs carved into the handle. I didn't know what it was for, but somehow I knew it had come from the basement. I couldn't take it anymore. I was going to leave, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to know. Needed to see what was down there. I took the key and slowly made my way to the basement door, Max right at my heels, still growling. The door opened with a low creak, revealing a narrow staircase that disappeared into darkness. With shaking hands, I flicked on the light switch. A single bulb flickered to life at the bottom, casting a dim, sickly glow over the stone walls. I took a deep breath and started down, the key clutched tightly in my hand. The basement was cold, the air thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something metallic and sharp. The walls were lined with shelves, cluttered with dusty boxes and stacks of old newspapers. But in the center of the room, under the light, was a large, ornate mirror propped against the wall. It looked entirely out of place, too pristine, like it hadn't aged a day. The frame was gold, covered in strange symbols I didn't recognize. I stared into the mirror, and for a moment, all I saw was my own pale, frightened face staring back. But then, the reflection changed. Behind me, I saw the figure, closer than ever, crouched and twisted, its elongated limbs stretching out toward me. Its face was shadowed, but I could make out eyes, wide, hollow, and empty, watching me with a cold, hungry gaze. I spun around, but the basement was empty. The figure was only in the mirror. I turned back slowly and saw it again, closer now, its fingers brushing against my shoulder in the reflection. A wave of nausea hit me as I realized that I couldn't move, couldn't break eye contact. I was trapped, rooted to the spot, as the figure's mouth twisted into a slow, sinister grin. And then it spoke. A voice like broken glass whispered, "You opened the door. Now you must stay. I don't know how long I was down there, staring into that mirror, frozen and numb. When I finally broke free and ran upstairs, it was daylight. I grabbed Max and bolted out the front door, never looking back. I left everything behind. My bag, my phone, even my shoes. I didn't care. I just wanted to get as far away from that house as possible. A few days later, I finally got a call from the owners. The old woman sounded confused, like she didn't remember hiring me at all. She said they'd come home to find the house empty, doors wide open, and a strange old mirror in the basement that she swore had never been there before. But here's the part that keeps me up at night, the detail that haunts me no matter how hard I try to forget. In the background, faint but unmistakable, I could hear it. The sound of nails clicking on the floorboards, growing louder, coming closer, as if something was making its way toward her, step by slow, deliberate. It was a Monday morning, the start of another busy week at the office, and I had my hands full with coffee and an armload of files when I bumped into Tom. He was new. The Meet the New Guy email had just gone out a few days before, announcing he'd be taking over some of the IT work. His eyes met mine, and he grinned like we were old friends. He apologized in that polite, overly warm way, but something about him gave me pause. Tom was average height, dark hair combed back, with a faded navy suit that didn't quite fit. I'd probably have forgotten the encounter if he hadn't looked right at me and said, "Don't worry, I'll keep an eye out for you." It was an odd thing to say, but I figured he was trying to be friendly. I smiled politely and got back to my desk, pushing the whole interaction out of my mind. A few days went by before I saw him again, this time in the break room. He was standing at the coffee maker, holding the empty pot with a sheepish expression, as if he'd been waiting to be caught in the act. "Oh, hey," he said, sounding genuinely happy to see me. "Didn't mean to hog the coffee," he added with a wink. I forced a polite chuckle, reaching for my own mug as he filled the pot. But as I turned to leave, he called after me. "You're always here early, huh?" he said a little too loud. "Good to see another early bird." He was smiling, almost beaming, like he'd learned some important piece of information. Yeah, I guess," I said, inching toward the door. "Mornings are the quietest time." He nodded enthusiastically, then added, "Quiet can be a good thing, gives you time to think." His smile lingered as I left, but there was something unsettling in his eyes, a glint that made me feel like he wasn't just being friendly. The next few days passed uneventfully, but I kept seeing him, more often than seemed coincidental. He'd be by the copier whenever I went to make copies, or in the hallway just as I was heading to the restroom. He even popped up at the elevator right when I was leaving for the day. Each time, he'd give me that same too friendly smile, the one that felt like he was studying me. One afternoon, I left work a little later than usual. As I made my way out, I spotted Tom in the lobby, leaning against the reception desk and talking to the security guard. He gave me a small wave and said, "Late night, huh?" I nodded politely, but he kept staring at me, eyes narrowing slightly. "Guess I'll see you in the morning then," he said a little too casually. Something about the way he said it made me uneasy. I tried to shrug it off, chalking it up to my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been waiting there just to see me leave. The next morning, I got in even earlier, hoping to avoid any more awkward run-ins. But when I walked into the office, Tom was already there, sitting at a desk just a few feet from mine. He looked up, surprised, like he hadn't expected to see me. "Wow, you beat me to it," he said, flashing that familiar grin. "Must be my lucky day." He laughed, but the way his eyes stayed on me was anything but friendly. From then on, it only got stranger. Every time I turned around, Tom was there, always with some casual excuse. Once, he told me he'd been reorganizing files in my department's shared drive, even though IT had no reason to be in there. Another time, he appeared in the conference room when I was preparing for a presentation, saying he was checking for any technical issues. At first, it was subtle enough that I could convince myself he was just overly eager, maybe lonely, and trying to make friends. But then he started asking questions that felt way too personal. "So, do you live close by?" he asked one afternoon, his tone casual, like he was just making small talk. I hesitated, keeping my response vague, but his questions kept coming, each one feeling a little more intrusive. "You ever grab drinks after work?" he asked another day. "Or are you more of a stay-at-home type?" I laughed it off, muttering something about being busy, but he wouldn't let it go. "You seem like you've got it all figured out," he said, his voice lowering. "Always organized, always on time, always predictable." He said it like it was some kind of compliment, but it sent a chill down my spine. The last straw came one Friday evening. I was about to leave when I noticed a sticky note on my desk. It was written in messy, slanted handwriting. "You work too hard. Maybe take a night off for once?" I stared at it, feeling a pit form in my stomach. I didn't have any close friends at the office. No one who'd leave me notes like that. I glanced around, hoping to see someone, anyone, but the floor was empty. The next morning, I went to HR and mentioned that one of the IT guys was making me uncomfortable. They nodded sympathetically, promising to look into it. I hoped that would be the end of it, but Tom's behavior didn't stop. If anything, it got worse. One night, I left work and noticed a figure walking behind me, close enough that I could hear footsteps echoing mine. I quickened my pace, heart pounding, but the footsteps matched my speed. When I glanced back, there he was, walking a little too close, his eyes locked on me. I ducked into a coffee shop, heart racing, and waited inside until I was sure he'd left. On Monday morning, he was waiting at my desk. "Saw you out Friday night," he said with a smirk. "Thought I'd say hi, but you looked busy." There was something almost accusing in his tone. "Yeah, I had plans," I stammered, trying to keep my voice steady. He stared at me for a moment, his expression unreadable, then shrugged. "Guess I'll see you around then," he muttered, his eyes lingering on me a beat too long before he walked away. After that, I couldn't concentrate. I felt his eyes on me constantly, even when he wasn't there. I'd look up from my desk and swear I saw him ducking around the corner, or hear his footsteps echoing in the hallway. The final straw came a week later when I found another note on my desk, this one even more disturbing. "I know you're busy, but I'll wait as long as it takes." I reported it to HR again, more urgently this time, but they brushed it off as just a misunderstanding. I knew then that no one would take me seriously until something bad actually happened. The next day, I packed up my things and left the office early, my heart pounding as I made my way to my car. As I unlocked the door, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see him watching from the shadows. But the lot was empty, eerily silent. I drove home with my heart racing, every shadow and passing car making me jump. When I finally got inside, I locked all the doors, double-checking each one. That night, I lay awake, listening to every creak and groan of the building, half convinced I'd see his face in my window. A few weeks later, I found another job and left without saying goodbye. I still don't know if Tom ever meant any real harm, if he was just awkward and lonely, or if his fixation had darker intentions. I never saw him again, but sometimes in crowded places or walking home at night, I feel like I catch a glimpse of him in the crowd, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to reappear. The first time I saw him, I was on my way home from work, late enough that the streets were mostly empty. He was standing under a street lamp, his back to me, wearing a long dark coat and a hat with a brim that threw his face into shadow. At first, he looked like any other stranger, someone waiting for a cab maybe, but something about his stillness was unsettling. It was as if he'd frozen there, turned to stone, with his head slightly tilted toward the empty street. I shook off the feeling and kept walking, thinking I'd just had a long day and was letting my imagination get to me. But that night, I dreamed of him. He was standing in the corner of my bedroom, hat tilted down, face hidden. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, and as I watched, he took a slow step forward. The room went cold, my heart pounding so loud it hurt, and then I woke up, gasping, drenched in sweat. The next morning, I laughed it off, telling myself I'd just had a nightmare because of that strange man on the street. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, like a door I didn't know was there had creaked open in my mind. As the days passed, strange things started happening. Small things barely noticeable on their own, but each one made me feel like a tiny thread of my reality was fraying, coming undone. One morning, I woke up to find my kitchen cabinets open, every single one. I knew I'd closed them the night before. The air was cold and still, and the hairs on my arms prickled. I told myself it was a draft, that I'd forgotten to shut them properly, but it felt like a lie even as I thought it. I closed the cabinets and went to make coffee, only to find the coffee pot missing from its usual place. I searched the whole kitchen, finally finding it sitting on my nightstand, half filled with water. Things kept moving. Shoes ended up in the bathroom, towels on the kitchen floor, books piled in the hallway. Every time, I tried to come up with a logical explanation, convincing myself I'd put things there absent-mindedly, even though I knew I hadn't. It felt like my apartment was slowly twisting out of my control, becoming something I didn't quite recognize. One evening, I was folding laundry when I heard a soft humming coming from the hallway outside my door. It was low, almost tuneless, like someone trying to remember a song, but getting it wrong. I froze, listening, the familiar fear prickling up my spine. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving an uncomfortable silence, as though the hallway itself was holding its breath. I tiptoed to the door and peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty. Just as I started to pull back, a shadow flitted across my view, close to the door, so close that I could see the faint outline of a hat, a wide-brimmed hat, tilted down just enough to hide a face. My breath caught, and I stumbled back from the door, heart racing. I waited, listening, but there was only silence. After that, the man started appearing more frequently, but always just out of reach. I'd catch a glimpse of him reflected in a shop window or standing across the street, motionless. Every time, he'd be gone the moment I blinked, leaving me to question if I'd even seen him at all. People I passed on the street would give me odd looks, like they recognized me, but couldn't place from where. It was unsettling, like I was the one who didn't belong. Things escalated when I began seeing words written in unexpected places. They were scrawled in faint pencil on the back of a cereal box, carved into the soft wood of my dresser drawer, scratched into the bathroom mirror. Each time, it was the same word, remember. One night, after another sighting of the man in the hallway, I decided I'd had enough. I called my friend Alex and asked him to stay over. He showed up around midnight, carrying a bag of chips and a couple of beers, brushing off my strange request with an easygoing laugh. But as I told him about everything, the strange man, the moving objects, the writing, his expression grew serious. He didn't laugh it off like I expected. Instead, he nodded, telling me he'd stay up with me, just in case. That night, we sat on the couch, talking about old times, trying to ignore the growing tension. Around 3 a.m., just as I was starting to doze off, I heard the hum again. Low, rising and falling, almost like someone singing a lullaby. Alex heard it too. He sat up, his face tense, eyes darting toward the door. The humming grew louder, closer, as though it were seeping through the walls themselves. Alex whispered, "Do you have neighbors with kids?" I shook my head, feeling a sickening sense of dread. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had begun, and a suffocating silence filled the room. Then, slowly, the doorknob began to turn. Alex and I froze, staring as the knob twisted, moving in short, jerky motions, as if someone on the other side was struggling to open it. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was paralyzed, trapped by a force I couldn't explain. Finally, the knob stopped turning, and the silence returned, heavy and unnatural. After that night, Alex wouldn't come over anymore. I couldn't blame him. I wouldn't have stayed either. But now I was alone again, with the man who kept coming closer. My apartment became a place of dread, each room filled with a quiet, lingering sense of something unseen, watching. One night, I found a note on my pillow in handwriting that wasn't mine. "You don't belong here." I spent the rest of the night sitting against the door with a kitchen knife in my hand, waiting for the man in the hat to finally step out of the shadows. The walls felt like they were breathing, a slow and steady rhythm that seemed to match the beating of my own heart. The final straw came a week later, when I returned home after a long day, exhausted and frazzled. I tossed my keys on the counter and turned on the lights, only to find a figure sitting at my kitchen table, his back to me, hat tilted down. My blood ran cold, and I staggered back, mouth opening in a silent scream. Slowly, he turned his head, just enough that I could see a sliver of his face, a sharp, pale cheekbone, a mouth set in a thin, unmoving line. His eyes were hidden under the brim of his hat, but I felt them on me, cold and searching. Who are you?" I managed to whisper, the words barely escaping my lips. For a long, agonizing moment, he didn't respond. And then, in a voice that was soft, almost familiar, he said, "You know who I am. You've always known." Something inside me cracked, a memory fluttering at the edge of my mind, a memory I couldn't quite grasp. The room began to spin, and I felt myself sinking, the air growing thicker and darker, until I was surrounded by nothing but shadows. I don't remember what happened after that. When I woke up, the apartment was empty. The man was gone, leaving no trace that he'd ever been there. But things haven't gone back to normal. I still see him in the edges of my vision, a shadow passing by, his hat tilted just enough to keep his face hidden. I don't know if he's real, if any of this is real. I feel like a stranger in my own life, trapped between worlds. And every time I try to remember what happened that night, my mind goes blank, as if something or someone is keeping me from the truth. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear that low, tuneless humming, and I can't shake the feeling that I'm not alone. The man in the hat is still out there, watching, waiting, and I know, deep down, that he's waiting for me to remember something I'm not sure I want to know. It started with a tree, a massive, ancient oak with branches that spread across the sky like something out of a fairy tale. I'd walked past it 100 times on my way to work, but one morning, it just struck me as wrong. The shape, the way the branches stretched out and twisted at the tips. I was sure it hadn't looked like that yesterday. I actually stopped to stare at it, tilting my head, trying to figure out what had changed. After a moment, I shook my head, telling myself it was just early morning grogginess, and went on my way. But the feeling stuck with me all day. It was just a tree, for crying out loud. How could a tree look off? That night, as I walked home, I felt like something was watching me. Every time I passed under a streetlight, the shadows seemed to linger a little longer, stretched out like they wanted to grab me. I quickened my pace, shaking off the feeling, but then I passed the same oak tree again, and it felt even stranger in the dark. I couldn't pinpoint why. Maybe it was the way the branches hung a little too low, or the way the leaves seemed to shiver, even though there wasn't a breeze. I looked away, deciding not to feed into my own weird nerves. The next morning, though, I swear the tree was closer. It sounds insane, but it felt like it had shifted, leaned forward just enough to be noticeable, like it was bending toward the path. I could have chalked it up to some strange optical illusion, but as I walked by, I felt an intense pressure, like the air was somehow denser around it. The branches creaked, as though they were settling into place, and I nearly ran the rest of the way to the train station. By the time I got to work, my heart was still racing. I tried to push the thought away, bury myself in tasks and emails, but my mind kept circling back to that tree. It wasn't just the tree, either. Other small things had started to feel off in the same quiet, insistent way. My coffee cup, for example. I always left it on the left side of my desk, but now it kept ending up on the right, like someone was moving it when I wasn't looking. I'd find the same file left open on my computer each morning, a document I hadn't touched in weeks. The blinds at my desk were slightly crooked, even though I'd fixed them a few days ago. And the screen on my computer, every time I sat down, it seemed like someone had adjusted the brightness just a notch too high. Each of these things was so small on its own. Little slips I'd have written off if they hadn't kept piling up. I felt a creeping paranoia, like my surroundings were subtly rearranging themselves. By the end of the week, it was almost unbearable. Every object in my apartment seemed to have shifted an inch to the left, and even my favorite chair felt too close to the wall. The pictures on my walls were tilted, even though I'd straightened them the night before. It was as if someone had walked through my life and nudged each object slightly out of place. One night, I came home to find my bedroom mirror facing the wrong direction. I knew for a fact it had always faced the door, so I could glance at it on my way out, but now it was turned to face the window instead. A part of me wanted to laugh it off, but there was something unsettling about it, something that made me hesitate before walking into the room. I reached out to touch the mirror, almost afraid that my own reflection might do something unexpected, like wink or blink out of sync. That was when the dream started. Each night, I found myself back at that oak tree. In the dream, it was enormous, towering high above me, its branches coiling like twisted arms reaching out. I could feel the rough bark under my fingers as I placed my hands on the trunk, feeling the pulse of something alive and ancient. But each time I tried to move away, my feet sank into the ground as if the earth itself were holding me in place. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, the feeling of bark still prickling my hands. Eventually, I stopped walking by the tree altogether. I'd take the long way to work just to avoid it. But somehow, that feeling followed me. I'd be sitting at my desk, and suddenly, I'd feel an itch on the back of my neck, a prickle of awareness that something was there, watching me. It was everywhere I went, the feeling that things were subtly adjusting, closing in on me, keeping me on an invisible track. One night, I woke up in a panic, my heart pounding. I'd had the worst dream yet, one where I'd been trapped inside the tree itself. My arms melded into the wood, the bark creeping up my skin. I staggered out of bed, trying to shake off the feeling, and walked to the bathroom to splash water on my face. But as I looked up, I saw something in the mirror that made me freeze. My eyes, they were a little too dark. I leaned in closer, trying to see, and realized the pupils were dilated, spreading out in a way that didn't look natural, didn't look human. For a moment, I just stared, my mind blank with horror. Then, without warning, my reflection smiled. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over myself, heart hammering so loud I could barely think. But when I looked again, everything was normal. My reflection stared back, expressionless, as if daring me to question what I'd seen. By this point, I knew I was losing it. I couldn't trust my own senses anymore, couldn't tell what was real. The world around me felt like it was slowly unraveling, like the edges of a painting peeling away to reveal something darker underneath. I started staying late at work, terrified to go home, terrified to sleep, terrified of what I might find waiting for me. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided I had to confront the tree. I walked to the park, clutching my phone like a lifeline, feeling the weight of the air press down on me as I approached. It was late, and the park was deserted, shrouded in an eerie stillness. As I neared the tree, I could see its massive branches looming like skeletal arms against the night sky, stretching impossibly wide, as though the tree had grown twice its usual size. When I got close enough, I felt an overwhelming urge to place my hand on the bark. My fingers trembled, but I reached out, touching the rough, ancient wood. It was cold, colder than it should have been, like I was touching something dead. For a second, everything around me seemed to fade, the sounds of the city vanishing, leaving only the silence and the slow, rhythmic beat of something pulsing within the tree. And then, I heard it, a whisper, faint but unmistakable, coming from deep within the trunk. "We see you." I jerked my hand back, stumbling away, feeling like my skin had been burned. I backed up, shaking, and as I turned to leave, I caught a movement out of the corner of my eye. There, standing just a few feet away, was someone who looked exactly like me, staring back with that same too dark gaze. My reflection, ripped straight from the mirror, watching with a crooked smile. I ran. I didn't stop until I was out of the park, my lungs burning, my mind spinning. When I finally got home, I locked every door, every window, as if that would keep whatever this was at bay. I paced the apartment, trying to steady my breathing, but everywhere I looked, I saw subtle changes. The crooked picture frames, the slight tilt of the mirror, the shadows pooling in the corners, stretching like they were alive. That night, I dreamed again of the tree, but this time, it wasn't just me who was trapped. I saw countless faces within the bark, all staring out with empty eyes, mouths open in silent screams. And as I looked closer, I realized they weren't strangers. They were people I'd passed on the street, people I'd seen at work, neighbors, friends, even family. All caught, all twisted into the tree's ancient wood, as if it had claimed them one by one. When I woke up, the world felt different, sharper, like every object in my apartment had an edge, like everything was a potential trap. I no longer knew if what I was seeing was real or some shadow of reality, a twisted reflection of a life I thought was mine. I didn't go to work that day. I couldn't. Instead, I sat in my apartment, waiting, feeling the walls closing in, knowing that whatever this was, it wouldn't stop until I was just another face in the bark, trapped in a cycle that went on forever. It was a hot summer day, one of those oppressive, muggy days where even breathing felt like a chore. I was in line at the ice cream truck, dripping sweat and wishing it would just move faster. I spotted him standing a few people behind me, looking as uncomfortable as the rest of us. Nothing about him stood out. Average height, dark sunglasses, tan skin, a plain t-shirt. Maybe just a guy out for a treat like the rest of us. When I got my ice cream, I found a shaded spot under a tree to eat it, savoring the brief relief from the heat. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him again, a few feet away, just standing there eating his cone. A strange feeling prickled at the back of my mind, but I brushed it off as nothing. It's a small park, after all. A week later, I was back at the park after work, trying to clear my mind with a walk. The air had a hint of that evening chill, and I was enjoying the solitude of the path winding along the creek. Then, as I rounded a bend, there he was again, just standing there leaning against a tree. He was looking out over the water, seemingly lost in thought, but something about the way he straightened up when he noticed me made me feel watched. I tried to act casual, but as I walked by, I could feel his gaze on me, that unsettling sense of being noticed sinking into my skin. I shook it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. It was a popular park, plenty of people walked here. But then I saw him again the next day, this time at the grocery store. He was walking toward me, looking directly at me with those same dark sunglasses that made it impossible to see his eyes. When he noticed that I'd spotted him, he raised a hand in an awkward wave, as if we were old acquaintances. I gave him a tight smile, quickly ducked into the produce aisle, and took a long, roundabout path through the store just to avoid running into him again. After that, I started seeing him everywhere. At the coffee shop across from my office, sitting 2 tables away, with a newspaper obscuring his face. In the parking lot of my gym, casually leaning against his car as if waiting for someone. Once, he was even at my bus stop sitting on the bench and scrolling through his phone, but as soon as I arrived, he pocketed it and just watched me. Each encounter felt innocent enough on its own, but all together, they felt like puzzle pieces forming a picture that I didn't want to look at too closely. One night, I decided to switch things up. I went to a small, obscure bar on the other side of town, a place I'd never been before. I ordered a drink, settled into a booth in the back, and tried to forget about him, about the way his presence had wormed its way into my life. Halfway through my drink, though, I felt a presence nearby. I looked up, and there he was, standing at the bar, ordering a drink and glancing over at me. My blood ran cold. I couldn't pretend it was a coincidence anymore. I'd come to this bar specifically to get away, to escape the pattern, and somehow he'd known. I debated leaving, but something in me snapped, a surge of anger stronger than the fear that had been brewing for weeks. I walked up to him and demanded, "Why are you following me?" He seemed genuinely taken aback, lifting his hands in a gesture of innocence. "Hey, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just here for a drink, same as you." I stared at him, waiting for the calm, reasonable explanation that would make this all seem like a misunderstanding. But he just smiled, something thin and almost mocking, and turned back to his drink. The nerve of it made me feel humiliated, like he was laughing at me, daring me to prove anything. The next morning, I went to the police. I didn't have much to give them. No evidence, no threats, just a series of coincidences that only seemed sinister when I strung them together. They told me there wasn't anything they could do without concrete evidence, and that it might just be unintentional encounters. They advised me to stay aware of my surroundings and call back if he did anything more overtly threatening. I left the station with a nauseating sense of powerlessness, my mind racing with all the things he could do before it would be considered overtly threatening. In the following days, the tension grew unbearable. I started taking photos of him whenever I saw him, hoping to collect enough proof to convince the police. Each time, he would smile slightly, acknowledging the camera without even flinching, as if daring me to report him. The photos didn't help, though. He was careful, always at a respectable distance, never making a move that could be labeled as menacing. I'd show the photos to friends, but they'd give me that hesitant look, The one that said they weren't sure if I was paranoid or if something strange was actually happening. Then, one night, I got home to find a letter taped to my apartment door. No envelope, no address, just a single sheet of paper with a typewritten message. You can try to run, but I'll always find you. I stood there, the words blurring in front of me as the world seemed to tilt. I stumbled inside, locking the door, heart hammering so hard I thought I might pass out. My mind raced through every possible scenario. Had he been watching my building? Had he followed me home? I called the police again, but with no physical evidence, they couldn't do much besides log it in their system. They assured me it was probably a prank. Maybe someone who'd heard about my concerns and was trying to mess with me. But the dead look in his eyes haunted me. The way he always seemed one step ahead, perfectly balancing on that razor-thin line between coincidence and crime. The next morning, I noticed something even more unnerving. My schedule had become eerily predictable. I was in the office by 9, out for lunch at noon, back at my desk by 1 o'clock, at the gym by 6:30. My life had fallen into a rhythm, and I'd done nothing to change it, despite everything. That predictability felt like an invitation. The more I thought about it, the more it made sense that he'd been able to follow me so easily. He knew exactly where I'd be, and I'd made it almost effortless. So, I started switching things up. I took random days off, worked from different locations, hit the grocery store at odd hours. I didn't see him for days, and the tension slowly melted into something resembling relief. For a while I thought maybe it had worked. Maybe I'd thrown him off. Maybe he'd finally given up. But one night, just as I was starting to let my guard down, I got a message from an unknown number. It was a photo, a grainy shot of me, taken from a distance as I walked to my car. Underneath it, he'd written, "Miss me?" The nausea hit me so hard I nearly dropped my phone. He was back, and somehow, despite all my efforts, he knew exactly where I was. I changed my number the next day, blocked any unknown contacts, and began limiting my time outside. My life became a prison of my own making, a series of hiding spots and escape routes that I planned obsessively. I barely saw friends anymore, couldn't bring myself to talk about it. Even as I felt my entire world shrinking, bending to the will of this man I barely knew. Now, every time I leave my apartment, I brace myself, half expecting to see him lurking in the background, blending into the crowd. I can't tell if he's still there, or if he's just found a better way to hide, slipping in and out of my life like a phantom. And the worst part is, I can't shake the feeling that I've somehow become part of his plan, that every action I take is exactly what he wants. I don't know if it's paranoia or if he's really there, watching, waiting. All I know is that he's out there, and somehow, he's still always one step ahead. The first glitch happened on a Sunday. I'd spent most of the day tidying up my apartment. An overdue cleaning binge where I tossed out old magazines, reorganized my closet, even sorted my junk drawer by size and purpose. By nightfall, I was exhausted but proud. I looked around my spotless place, satisfied, and sank onto the couch, stretching my arms with a sense of closure. But then, when I reached for the remote to turn on the TV, something felt off. The remote wasn't on the coffee table where I'd left it minutes ago. Instead, it was across the room, sitting on top of a stack of those magazines I'd thrown out. Ifros, Stering. I hadn't taken anything out of the trash, and I certainly hadn't put the remote over there. I walked over to the stack, heart hammering, and picked up the remote. I even checked the batteries, as if that would explain anything. For a moment, I told myself it was simple forgetfulness, maybe a trick of exhaustion. But it felt wrong. Wrong in a way I couldn't shake, like I was missing the punchline to a joke I'd never heard. Monday morning, I woke up to another surprise. I have this shelf in my kitchen where I keep spices, all labeled and arranged by flavor profile. But when I reached for the paprika, I noticed all the labels were reversed, facing the wall. My heart dropped. I never did that. I never even moved the spices from their spots. I thought about the remote, sitting on that random stack of magazines. I hadn't been exhausted enough to rearrange my spices and forget about it. No, this was different, like a tiny, personal mystery that didn't care if I had an answer. Days went by, and things only got weirder. Objects would vanish from one room, only to appear in another without explanation. The pen I kept by my bedside started showing up in my bathroom cabinet, wedged between the shampoo and my razor. I'd go to bed with my lamp off and wake up to find it shining in my face. I began second-guessing everything, wondering if I was sleepwalking or if maybe I was just losing it. But even those explanations felt thin. It was as if my own home was shifting around me, playing tricks with my belongings. Eventually, the disturbances extended beyond my apartment. On my way to work one Thursday, I saw my neighbor Lucy standing outside our building, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup. She waved and smiled, and I waved back. But when I glanced back over my shoulder a few seconds later, she was gone. I scanned the street, but it was empty. No one had gone inside, and there was no way she could have disappeared so fast. For the rest of the day, I convinced myself I was just seeing things, imagining her smile and her wave like a weird daydream. But that didn't explain the way she reappeared a few blocks down later that morning, sipping her coffee, her wave identical to the one I'd seen before. After that, the glitches became bolder. I'd leave my office for lunch and come back to find my computer open to websites I didn't recognize. My files would rearrange themselves alphabetically when I'd always sorted them by date. One morning, I found my entire inbox wiped clean, every email replaced by an empty message titled "Remember Me?" I stared at the screen, heart racing, trying to click each email, but they all vanished as soon as I opened them. The world outside started shifting too. Streets I walked daily looked slightly different. Street names would swap out randomly. And sometimes, when I'd look up at a familiar building, there'd be an extra floor that hadn't been there the day before. I mentioned it once to a coworker, and he laughed, saying I was just tired. But then, on a quiet Friday night, I ran into him at a bar downtown, and he didn't recognize me at all. He looked straight through me like I was a stranger. When I tried to remind him of who I was, his eyes glazed over, and he muttered something about needing to catch a bus before disappearing into the crowd. The last straw came a week later. I decided to meet some friends for dinner, a rare treat to get out of the house and escape the strange happenings at home. But as I sat down with them, I noticed everyone was talking in these strange, slightly robotic voices. They asked me about things I'd never done and told stories about times I couldn't remember, all while nodding and smiling like everything was completely normal. I sat there frozen, my fork hovering midair, realizing that I didn't know these people at all, and they didn't know me. I excused myself, muttering something about the bathroom, and left without looking back. Back at my apartment, I slammed the door shut, breathing hard. The place felt unfamiliar, almost hostile, as if it were bracing itself for another glitch. I tried to calm down, taking slow, deep breaths, telling myself that I just needed to sleep. But when I looked over at my couch, my stomach lurched. There was someone sitting on it, someone who looked exactly like me. She looked up at me with a small, knowing smile, a glint of amusement in her eyes as she patted the space next to her. "Took you long enough," she said, her voice exactly like mine, but with an edge, like she'd been waiting a long time for this moment. I felt a surge of fear, but I forced myself to walk closer, gripping the edge of the couch, my knuckles turning white. What are you?" She shrugged casually, crossing her legs. "I'm you, of course. The you that didn't get lost." She tilted her head, examining me like I was the oddity. "You've been slipping through the cracks for a while now, haven't you?" "What cracks?" My voice came out in a whisper, but I felt like I was about to scream. "What does that even mean?" Her eyes sparkled with something close to pity. "You've been wandering between worlds, brushing up against different versions of yourself. Didn't you wonder why things felt so strange? Why your own life felt borrowed?" I could barely breathe. "No, that can't be." "Oh, but it is." She leaned forward, her gaze intense, pinning me to the spot. "Every time you notice something out of place, a version of you is stepping closer, nudging you off course, bringing you here." She leaned back, smiling like she'd just won a game. "This is where you end up when you're not paying attention." I backed away, heart pounding, my mind racing. It felt like a nightmare, like some twisted reality I couldn't escape. But I couldn't stop myself from asking, "What happens now?" The other me shrugged, looking almost bored. Now you settle in? Get used to being the one watching from the outside. With that, she stood up, brushing past me and disappearing down the hallway, leaving me alone in my own apartment, or what used to be mine. As the door clicked shut behind her, a strange stillness settled over the room. I stood there, listening to my own heartbeat, feeling the weight of silence fill the space around me. And then, slowly, I walked over to the couch, sinking down into the spot she'd left. The room felt different now, like it was watching me, waiting to see what I'd do next. I looked around, noticing every little detail, every familiar object that now felt foreign. I sat there, feeling like a stranger in my own life, wondering if this was how it would be from now on. Every day, I'd watch myself slip further from the center, sliding deeper into a reality that felt like it belonged to someone else. Some nights, I see her reflection in the windows, staring back at me with that same knowing smile. And I wonder how long she'd been waiting for me to take her place, and if somewhere out there, another version of me is waiting for their turn, inching closer, waiting to cross the line into my life as I sit here, stuck on the outside, a ghost in my own skin. There was a time years ago when I thought I'd never make it out of a forest. I'd gone camping with some friends, a weekend escape to disconnect and embrace nature. We set up camp, laughed around a fire, swapped stories, and felt miles away from civilization. The campsite was in a dense forest, deep enough that the trees closed in like an ancient guard, the canopy thick enough to make noon feel like dusk. The first night was normal, and we drifted to sleep with the distant rustle of animals in the brush. Nothing unusual for the woods. On the second night, though, everything changed. Around midnight, a strange noise echoed through the trees, a kind of low, vibrating hum that seemed to come from all directions at once. We jolted awake, listening in silence as it grew louder, then faded into a bizarre stillness. No wind, no rustling, no animals, just silence. You know, they say the woods go quiet when something big is near, but this was different. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. One of my friends, Marcus, said he'd go check it out, thinking it might be some weird animal or a branch that fell nearby. He took a flashlight and disappeared between the trees, and the rest of us waited, listening, half joking to mask the nerves that were creeping in. 10 minutes passed, 15, then half an hour. He didn't come back. We started getting worried, calling his name and waving our flashlights into the trees. But the forest swallowed every sound, returning only muffled echoes. I felt this twist in my gut, a cold dread that I tried to ignore by telling myself he'd gotten turned around or was playing a prank. But as we waited, something strange started to happen. The forest began to change. The trees seemed to shift, casting shadows that stretched out like fingers reaching for us. The ground, once solid, felt oddly damp and yielding, and the air grew thick with the smell of earth, like freshly dug graves. After an hour, we knew something was wrong. I grabbed my flashlight, determined to find him, and set off alone. The others stayed at the campsite, too nervous to leave the small circle of light from our fire. As I walked, I felt an eerie pull from the woods, like it was leading me somewhere, drawing me deeper. My mind was racing, every crack of a branch sending jolts of fear through me, but I couldn't turn back. Something inside told me that if I left him out here, I'd regret it forever. I don't know how long I walked, maybe 10 minutes, maybe an hour. It all blurred together in the dim light of my flashlight, the trees pressing in closer, the shadows growing longer. Then I saw it, Marcus's flashlight, lying on the ground, flickering weakly. But there was no sign of Marcus, just his flashlight, abandoned, the beam pointing off into the darkness like a single eye watching me. I picked it up, scanning the area, calling his name. The silence was deafening, heavy, pressing down on me like a weight. And then, from somewhere deeper in the woods, I heard a soft whisper. Just my name, nothing else, but it was unmistakable, clear as a bell. I turned in that direction, heart pounding, and took a step forward when something grabbed my arm. I turned, expecting to see Marcus, but it was just shadows. Dark, shifting shapes curling around my arm like smoke, icy cold sinking into my skin. I froze, panic clawing in my throat, as the shadows seemed to wrap around me, filling the air with a strange, low hum, the same sound we'd heard before. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. All I could do was watch as the darkness closed in, pressing against my skin, tightening like a vice. Just when I thought I'd suffocate, the grip loosened, and I stumbled back, gasping, the shadows dissolving as quickly as they'd appeared. I spun around, shining my flashlight in all directions, but there was nothing. Just trees, silence, and the faint echo of that hum. I don't remember getting back to camp. My legs moved on their own, numb, carrying me through the maze of trees. When I finally broke through to the clearing, my friends were waiting, faces pale, eyes wide. "Did you find him?" One of them asked, barely a whisper. I shook my head, unable to speak, clutching Marcus's flashlight in my trembling hands. We searched for hours, calling his name, retracing every step, but there was no trace of him. By dawn, we had to give up, our nerves frayed, our minds reeling. We reported it to the Rangers, but they never found him. No one ever did. The official story was that he wandered off and got lost, but I knew better. I'd seen something out there, something that didn't belong. Even now, years later, I still have dreams of that night. I wake up to that same low hum, that thick silence, and shadows pressing in from every side. And sometimes, just before I wake, I swear I hear my name, soft, faint, like a whisper in the dark. I travel a lot for work, which means I'm usually in a different city every couple of weeks. It's not glamorous. It's mostly just airports, hotel rooms, and whatever local food spot has the best Yelp reviews. Last month, I was in a town I'd never heard of, doing a series of presentations for a client I wasn't too thrilled about. This place was even quieter than usual. No nightlife, hardly any shops, just an old, fading downtown with a bunch of thrift stores and an empty movie theater. But there was this tiny, homey diner a few blocks from my hotel, and the first morning I walked in, I knew it'd be my breakfast spot while I was there. It was one of those places where everyone knows each other, and as soon as I walked in, I felt a few heads turn. The server, a woman around my age named Melissa, came over and poured me a coffee before I even had a chance to ask. She was friendly in that easy way people are in small towns, and we made a bit of small talk. She asked where I was from, what I was doing in town, and I told her the basics. By the time I left, I had a bag of muffins for the road, and she waved me off like we'd been friends for years. Over the next few days, I settled into a routine. Early morning diner breakfast, meetings at the client's office, and then I'd head back to the hotel to unwind. Melissa was always there in the mornings, and by day 3, she didn't even need to take my order. Same as yesterday, she'd ask with a smile, and I'd nod, a little relieved to have some familiarity in this strange town. On the 4th day, though, things started to feel off. I walked in, and Melissa was already at the counter with my coffee and breakfast order ready. I hadn't even sat down yet, but there it was, steaming in front of my usual seat. She looked pleased with herself, like she'd pulled off some magic trick. I laughed, asking how she always seemed to know exactly when I'd show up. She just shrugged, her smile tight. I got a knack for it, I guess. Small town intuition. As I dug into my food, she came by to refill my coffee and mentioned that she'd seen me walking by the movie theater the night before. I nearly choked on my toast. I'd walked past the theater on my way back from a late dinner, but I hadn't seen a soul on the street. I laughed it off, joking that it must be hard not to bump into someone in a place this small. She laughed too, but the way she looked at me, like she was watching me too closely, made me feel exposed. That evening, I took a long walk around town, hoping to shake the odd feeling. I wandered down some back streets and ended up at the river that bordered the edge of town. It was quiet, dark except for a few streetlights flickering. After a while, I started heading back, and as I turned onto the street leading to my hotel, I spotted someone standing under a street lamp a block down. It was Melissa. She didn't seem to notice me, but she was just standing there, looking up at the windows of my hotel. I ducked back into the shadows, watching her. After a few minutes, she turned and started walking down the street, passing right by my hotel. It felt like she was checking up on me, like she was somehow keeping tabs. I chalked it up to coincidence. Maybe she lived nearby and was just heading home. The next morning, though, I woke up to find a text from an unknown number. "Hope you enjoyed the river walk. You looked peaceful. I felt my stomach drop. I hadn't told anyone about my walk, and I was sure I hadn't seen anyone else down there. I replied, "Who is this?" but got no response. Trying to shake the feeling, I went to the diner, but things were different. When I walked in, Melissa was already staring at me from behind the counter. She didn't smile or wave. She just watched me walk over to my seat, her eyes a little too sharp, a little too focused. "Sleep well?" she asked as she set my coffee down. The way she said it made my skin crawl. "Yeah," I mumbled, trying to brush it off. I didn't stay long that morning, but as I left, I caught her watching me out of the corner of my eye. She was holding her phone, her fingers tapping the screen, eyes on me the entire time. The text messages kept coming. Every night, I get another one, always from a different unknown number, but always with some unnervingly personal detail. "Nice suit today. The blue one looks good on you. Skipped the eggs this morning, I see. Saw you took a different route to the hotel tonight. Looking for something?" I knew someone was watching me, but I didn't know who or why. Finally, on my last day in town, I decided I'd confront her. I was tired of feeling like I was under surveillance, tired of looking over my shoulder. I walked into the diner and went straight up to the counter. She was standing there, looking unfazed, like she'd been waiting for me. Before I could even speak, she nodded at me. "Your check's covered today," she said. "Think of it as a parting gift." Her voice was flat, detached. I hesitated, my planned confrontation slipping away in the face of her eerie calm. She handed me a small, folded note along with my coffee. "Read it later," she said softly, then turned away and busied herself with the coffee machine. I left the diner, walking back to my hotel, clutching the note in my pocket. When I got to my room, I unfolded it. In neat handwriting, it read, "Sometimes it's best not to ask too many questions. Travel safe." I didn't wait to find out what that meant. I packed my things in record time, checked out, and started driving, eager to put as much distance as possible between me and that town. As I drove down the empty highway, my phone buzzed. Another text from a new, unknown number. "We'll be seeing you soon." I blocked the number and kept driving. But since then, every few weeks, I still get a message from an unknown number, wherever I am, whatever town I'm in. They're never overtly threatening, but they're always just a little too specific. "Red scarf today, suits you." Or, "Hope the meeting goes well. Big opportunity." I've changed phones, changed numbers, everything. And yet, somehow, they always seem to know. The day started like any other. I was brewing coffee, checking emails, and letting my mind drift into the usual morning fog when I noticed the first glitch, a quick flash, almost imperceptible, as if the light in the kitchen flickered. Only it wasn't the light. It was the air, the whole space around me shivering for half a second. I stood there, blinking, waiting for my vision to clear, wondering if it was just the after effect of a poor night's sleep. But everything settled, and I brushed it off. That evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I opened my closet to grab a fresh towel. That's when I noticed something strange. My reflection wasn't moving quite in sync with me. It was so subtle, the kind of thing you'd chalk up to paranoia if you'd had a few drinks. I stepped closer to the mirror, squinting. My reflection stood there, a fraction of a second behind. I leaned left, then right, and each time, my reflection followed. But there was a faint delay, just enough to make my skin prickle. I backed away and decided maybe I just needed a good night's sleep. The next day was worse. My reflection stayed behind again, the delay longer this time, almost noticeable in real time. I tried ignoring it, went to work, put my head down, and tried to focus. But the glitches kept happening, spreading out like cracks in glass. I'd catch things at the edges of my vision, a flicker of color in my peripheral sight, objects shifting just a little when I looked back. A coffee mug on my desk that I swear I just left on the kitchen counter. My phone buzzing with a notification, only for the screen to be empty when I picked it up. By the end of the week, I convinced myself I was coming down with something, maybe stress or fatigue. I told myself to ride it out, that it would pass if I ignored it. But that night, things crossed into something I couldn't explain away. I had barely closed my eyes when I heard a faint, rhythmic sound, almost like a tapping on my bedroom wall. I bolted up in bed, listening. It was subtle, quiet enough that it might have been my mind playing tricks on me. But as I focused, it grew louder, clearer, a slow, hollow knock that echoed from somewhere impossibly close. "Who's there?" I called, my voice thin, barely above a whisper. Silence. Then, just as I was convincing myself it was all in my head, a voice, soft and strained, like it was being dragged through static, answered from the darkness. "I am." My blood ran cold. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, but the voice had already faded, the silence thick and stifling, pressing down on me like a weighted blanket. I lay there, heart pounding, until I drifted into a restless sleep. When I woke up, the voice echoed in my memory, gnawing at the edges of my mind. It had felt so real, but there was no one there, nothing out of place in my room. I went about my day, avoiding mirrors, avoiding anything reflective. Yet, the glitches kept coming. Objects started shifting places without my touching them. I'd find my shoes lined up perfectly at the door, even though I always left them by my bed. My keys, which I left in the entryway bowl, would show up in my bathroom. Little things at first, things I could rationalize. But then, one morning, I found an old, worn-out book on my nightstand, a book I'd never seen before. The cover was faded, but I could make out the title, Through the Walls. I hesitated before picking it up, opening to a random page. The words were nonsense, sentences that trailed off into strange symbols, strings of letters that didn't form any words I knew. And on every page, a name was scribbled in tiny, shaky handwriting. Sophie. I didn't know any Sophie. Or at least I didn't think I did. But the name felt familiar, like it was something I should remember. I stuffed the book in a drawer, telling myself I'd deal with it later. That night, as I drifted off, the tapping returned, louder this time, as if it was right beside my head. I forced myself to ignore it, my heart hammering, but then I felt it, a cold, bony pressure on my shoulder. I shot up, looking around wildly, but no one was there. In the days that followed, Sophie's presence became more insistent. I'd hear her name whispered on the wind outside my window, catch glimpses of a shadow in my peripheral vision. Then I started seeing her everywhere. Only, it wasn't her. It was people, strangers, but their faces were wrong, their features blurred. Every face had the same hollow, lifeless eyes, like they were staring right through me. Every time I blinked, they vanished. One night, as I walked home, I caught sight of a woman in a shop window, her face familiar. She was standing alone in the reflection, watching me. The street behind her was empty, silent. I turned around, but no one was there. When I looked back, she was gone. When I got home, I ran to the bathroom, heart racing, and stared at my reflection. But this time, it didn't just lag. It stared back with a look I'd never seen on my own face. My mouth began to move on its own in the reflection, forming a word I couldn't hear, pressing urgently from the other side of the mirror, like it was trying to tell me something. My face twisted, my eyes wide and pleading. And then, just as I leaned closer, it mouthed a single word, clear as day. "Help!" I stumbled back, heart racing, but when I looked again, my face was normal, expressionless. Shaken, I left the bathroom, turning off every light in my apartment and crawling into bed. The next morning, my phone was missing. I tore my apartment apart, flipping couch cushions, emptying drawers, but it was nowhere to be found. As I searched, I heard a sound, a faint voice, repeating my name over and over. I followed it, heart hammering, and found my phone hidden in the very back of my closet. But when I picked it up, the screen was shattered, flickering with static. I could just barely make out a text notification, one new message from Sophie. My hands trembled as I opened it, but the message was blank. Just a name at the top, repeating over and over. Sophie. 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 I threw the phone down, backing away. The tapping started again, this time coming from all around me, the sound vibrating through the walls, the floors, even my own chest. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to drown it out, but the sound only grew louder, more insistent. I felt something cold close around my wrist, yanking me forward, and for a split second, I saw her, A woman with hollow eyes, her face twisted in desperation, fingers stretched out toward me. I screamed, pulling back, and the tapping stopped. Everything fell silent. When I opened my eyes, I was alone. My apartment as quiet and still as it had ever been. I haven't seen her since that night, but sometimes when I'm half asleep, I feel the pressure of her fingers on my shoulder, hear her voice whispering my name. And every now and then, I catch sight of that book, through the walls, in the strangest places. My bookshelf, my car, even at work. Always open to the same page, with her name scrawled in messy, frantic letters. I don't know what she wants or why she chose me, but every time I see my reflection, I wonder if she's still there, waiting, watching from the other side, trying to find a way through. And every night, just as I'm about to fall asleep, I hear her whisper, soft and desperate, "Help!" It was on a Friday evening when things started feeling off. I was out with friends, not doing anything particularly memorable, just a bar crawl across downtown. I'd left my phone at home by accident, something I realized only after I'd downed a couple of drinks. That was odd in itself, because I rarely forget my phone. I'm that person who'll turn the car around a mile out just to go back and get it. But that night, it felt like some other force had decided I didn't need it. That's how it all started. Around 11, I was standing by myself at the edge of the bar, waiting for a round of shots to arrive, when a woman brushed by, lightly grazing my arm. She had a familiar air about her, though I couldn't place it, as if I knew her from somewhere, but had forgotten. Her face was striking, a sharp jawline, large, intense green eyes, and she was wearing a deep purple coat, a color that seemed to glow in the dim light. As she passed, she said, "I'll see you again. You'll remember soon." The way she said it wasn't friendly or flirtatious. It was matter of fact, like she was pointing out something obvious. I laughed it off as some random bar interaction and thought nothing more about it at first. But about 20 minutes later, I felt a weird sensation in my chest, like the room was stretching. I looked around, and everything felt a few inches out of sync. My friends' voices started to blur, like I was underwater, and I realized I was gripping the bar for support, feeling woozy. When I finally blinked and cleared my head, I checked the time on the bar's wall clock. It was almost 1 a.m. 2 whole hours had slipped by like a snap of the fingers. My friends were nowhere to be found, and I couldn't remember a single thing that had happened since the woman in the purple coat brushed by me. It felt like I'd closed my eyes for a second and woken up in an entirely different moment. The bartender, noticing my disoriented look, asked if I was all right. I mumbled something about losing track of time, but I couldn't shake the sensation that something was very wrong. The next morning, I decided to let it go as just a weird night. But over the next few days, I kept seeing her everywhere, the woman in the purple coat. She was in the grocery store, flipping through cans of soup like she couldn't decide. She was in line at the coffee shop, always just ahead of me, though she never looked back. Once, I saw her across the street, leaning against a lamp post, watching me. Each time I saw her, she looked slightly different. Her hair might be longer, her eyes darker, her coat a shade brighter, but it was definitely her. And every time, she'd give me a look as if she were waiting for me to say something. By the following week, I was obsessing over her. I'd find myself scouring the places I'd seen her before, hoping for another glimpse. It felt irrational, but something about her presence kept tugging at the edges of my memory, as if I'd forgotten something crucial. One night, while I was lying in bed, I woke up to the sound of a knock. It was soft, deliberate, coming from the front door. My heart pounded, but I got up and tiptoed down the hall, each creak of the floorboards amplifying my unease. When I opened the door, no one was there, only the empty, silent street outside. But as I was about to close it, I saw something on the doormat, a single violet flower. I knew I hadn't put it there, and it wasn't something my friends would have done. The gesture was eerie in its simplicity. I picked it up and went back inside, studying its petals. I felt an overwhelming sense of familiarity that I couldn't place. Then I heard her voice, as clear as if she were standing next to me. "You'll remember soon." I spun around, expecting to see her, but I was alone in my dark apartment, holding a flower that looked freshly picked. I barely slept that night, my mind reeling the words "you'll remember" echoing in my head. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that my life was unspooling in ways I couldn't control. I'd lose hours, sometimes entire afternoons. Once, I'd been writing an email at work, and when I looked up at the clock, it was after 6. I had no memory of the hours that had passed, but the email was finished, sitting in my outbox like I'd written it in some other state of mind. One evening, desperate for answers, I wandered downtown, retracing the places I'd seen her, hoping that maybe she'd show up again. I walked for hours, and just as I was about to give up, I spotted her reflection in the window of a shop. She was behind me, close enough to reach out and touch, her face somber. I whirled around to confront her, but she was gone. In her place stood a mirror image of me, staring back, expression vacant, as though it were watching me instead of reflecting me. Suddenly, flashes of memories began flooding my mind. Moments I'd somehow overlooked, dreams I'd forgotten, snippets of conversations I didn't remember having. I saw myself sitting with her at a table in some dimly lit place, talking, laughing, but I couldn't hear the words. Another memory hit, her handing me that same violet flower in a field, my hands reaching out to take it. Each memory felt disturbingly familiar, as though it had once been a part of my life but had been cut out, edited, and tucked away. It was like I was reliving two lives at once, my own and another that existed in these glimpses with her. The memories left me drained, as though they'd siphoned pieces of me each time I recalled them. I returned home that night, exhausted and shaken, desperate to find something that would ground me. As I climbed into bed, I noticed the violet flower still lying on my nightstand. It had withered since I'd brought it in, its petals fragile and brown, almost as if it had aged far beyond its time. I reached for it, and in that instant, my vision blurred, and I felt my surroundings shift, like the room had rearranged itself around me. I wasn't in my apartment anymore. I was sitting at that table with her, the same dimly lit room from my memory. She was across from me, looking sad this time, her eyes filled with a sympathy that felt as ancient as it was unsettling. She leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. "You're almost there," she said, her words laced with a finality I couldn't ignore. "Almost where?" I asked, though my own voice sounded distant, as though it belonged to someone else. "Back," she whispered. "Back to where we started. Don't you remember?" The memories swirled again, fragmented and dreamlike. In that instant, I understood these glitches I'd experienced weren't interruptions in my life. They were my life, playing out across different timelines, fractured but connected, each version of me leaving echoes for the others to follow. Each encounter with her had been a piece of a puzzle, leading me back to this moment. She stood up, her image blurring as she began to fade. "I'll see you again," she said softly, her words a promise and a farewell. Then I was back in my apartment, alone, the room silent and still. The flower on my nightstand had turned to dust, leaving only a faint trace of violet on the wood. I sat there, feeling the weight of all those versions of myself, as if I were watching my own life through a cracked mirror, each shard showing a different reflection, each memory overlapping with the next. Now, sometimes I catch a glimpse of myself in reflective surfaces and feel that same unease, wondering if the person looking back is really me, or just another version, watching from a life I almost remember but can't quite reach. The day we left my childhood home, Mom handed me a box that looked like it hadn't been touched since the 90s, full of odds and ends from my bedroom that had somehow survived the years. I glanced inside and found old concert tickets, a collection of friendship bracelets I'd made from the summer camp that I'd hated, and an old pocket knife I hadn't seen since I was 10. I'd forgotten about these things, but as I turned them over in my hands, they felt weirdly familiar, like echoes of another self. "Take it or leave it," Mom said, looking around the empty living room like she wasn't sure if she'd remember what it looked like after today. The walls were stripped bare, our voices echoing off the empty walls. "I'll take it," I said, though I had no idea where I'd put it in my apartment, which was already stuffed with more things than I could handle. But throwing it away seemed unthinkable. That box held memories, pieces of a life I didn't know I'd want to remember. Mom gave me a small, sad smile, The kind that only appears when you're watching something familiar disappear. "It's funny, she murmured, "how much you leave behind. And yet, you still feel like you're taking all of it with you." There was an awkward silence as I didn't know how to respond to that. We both just stood there, staring at the bare walls, each of us absorbing the weight of the moment in our own way. I wanted to tell her I understood, that it felt strange for me, too, to be leaving the only home I'd ever really known. But the words wouldn't come, so I just held the box tighter. I spent the next few weeks moving my life into my tiny apartment, organizing things into spaces that didn't quite fit. But the box sat unopened in the corner, a little time capsule I wasn't quite ready to open again. Life kept moving, work kept coming, and soon enough, that box just became another piece of clutter, a thing I kept promising to sort through one day. Then, a few months later, in the middle of a sleepless night, I found myself sitting cross-legged on the floor, staring at it. There was a strange energy in the room, like the past was tugging on my sleeve, whispering something I couldn't quite hear. I opened the box. The smell hit me first, a mix of old paper, dust, and something I couldn't quite place, maybe a hint of my mom's perfume. It was like opening a door to another world. My hand started to shake a little as I pulled things out, one by one. A crumpled birthday card from my 6th grade best friend. A folded paper crane I'd made one summer after Dad taught me how. A pressed daisy, browned and brittle, that I must have picked years ago. At the bottom of the box, half buried under an old Walkman and some mixtapes I'd made in high school, I found a faded Polaroid. It was me, probably 10 years old, holding up a half-finished sandcastle, my face covered in freckles and my eyes lit up with some unknown joy. I barely recognized myself. Staring at the photo, I felt something crack open inside me. I remembered that summer, the last one we'd spent as a family before Dad left. I remembered the feeling of sand under my toes, the sharp, salty air, and the way my heart had felt so full and free, not weighed down by all the things that would come later. I hadn't thought of that summer in years, and now the memory washed over me with a strange, bittersweet clarity. I was still sitting on the floor, lost in thought, when my phone buzzed. It was a text from my brother, Nate. We hadn't talked much since he'd moved out west a few years ago. His text was simple, just a picture of an old sketchbook. "Found this in a box from Mom's house. Remember drawing these?" I stared at the screen, the timing uncanny. Nate and I had spent countless afternoons sketching in that book, each trying to one-up the other with ridiculous monsters and creatures. I thought it was lost years ago, another casualty of our fractured family history. But here it was, somehow, connecting us across time and distance. I shot him a text back, "Wow, blast from the past. How's it going out there?" A few seconds later, he replied, "Not bad. Just feels weird going through all this old stuff, like looking at a version of us that doesn't exist anymore." I knew exactly what he meant. Holding that photo of myself, the girl in the sandcastle felt like a stranger. And yet, she was me, just a younger, simpler version, untouched by the years that had come after. I wondered what she'd think if she could see me now, sitting alone on the floor of a cramped apartment, wrestling with a box of memories. Nate's next text came through, unexpected. "Hey, remember that road trip we always talked about?" It was a hazy memory, something we'd dreamed up as kids on a rainy day when we were stuck inside, bored out of our minds. We planned to drive up the coast, stopping at every weird tourist trap we could find. We'd never taken the trip. Life had gotten in the way, as it always does. But reading his message, the old excitement sparked back to life, fragile but real. "Yeah, we should actually do it sometime." For a long moment, he didn't respond. I wondered if I'd overstepped, if this was just one of those nostalgic what-ifs that never actually happens. But then he replied, "Spring. Let's do it." I blinked at the screen, feeling a smile spread across my face. Something real and warm that I hadn't felt in a while. "It's a deal," I typed back, feeling a strange thrill at the idea that maybe, just maybe, this trip could happen. We didn't say anything else. It felt like everything had already been said. But after I put the phone down, I kept looking at that photo of my younger self, remembering that carefree girl who built sandcastles without worrying if the waves would wash them away. She didn't know anything about heartbreak, about the people you lose along the way, or the weight of saying goodbye to places you thought you'd never leave. But maybe she knew something I'd forgotten. How to hope, how to believe that new things could grow from the wreckage of the old. I carefully placed the Polaroid back in the box, closed the lid, and tucked it under my bed. It wasn't something I needed to hold on to every day, but it was something I wanted to keep close, a reminder of where I'd come from, and maybe where I was going next. As I lay in bed that night, I felt a strange peace settle over me, a quiet understanding that maybe, just maybe, things had a way of coming full circle. The road trip, the box, the sandcastle girl. All pieces of the same story, my story carrying me forward into whatever came next. It started with my dog, Max. He was a scrappy mutt with too much energy and a bark that could rattle glass. The kind of dog that somehow always knew when I needed company. One morning, as I was getting ready for work, I called him over, expecting to see his shaggy, wagging figure dart out from around the corner. But he just stood there at the edge of the hallway, staring at me with a strange look, focused like he was studying me. I called his name again, louder this time, but he didn't move, didn't bark. Just stared. The hairs on my arms prickled. His expression was wrong. It wasn't just that he was still, it was how aware he looked, like he was seeing right through me. I approached him slowly, unsure if he was sick or injured, and knelt down to look him in the eye. "Max, what's up, buddy?" He tilted his head slightly, his eyes never leaving mine, as if he was searching for something in my face. After a long moment, he blinked, and just like that, he was back to his usual self, bounding around, tail wagging as he pawed at my hand. I laughed it off, thinking maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, but that moment lingered, unsettling in its quiet strangeness. That was only the beginning. Over the next few days, little things around the house started to feel off, subtle at first. Things like my coffee cup not being where I'd left it, lights flickering when I was the only one home, doors that I was sure I'd closed swinging open on their own. One night, I found my keys in the freezer, nestled between the frozen peas and a bag of ice. I laughed it off as stress or forgetfulness, but it was becoming harder to ignore. One afternoon, I came home from work and found my house eerily silent. Usually, Max would come running the second I walked through the door, but today, nothing. I called for him, checked the rooms, went to the backyard, but he was gone. Panic started to creep in, but then I heard a soft whine from the living room. I rushed in and found him crouched in the corner, staring at the wall. "Mux," I said, my voice wavering. His head jerked around to face me, his eyes wide and unfocused. He slowly turned back to the wall, his whole body tense, his ears pricked, listening for something I couldn't hear. I sat beside him, reaching out to touch his back, but the second my hand brushed his fur, he let out a low, strange growl, deep and unfamiliar. I pulled back, surprised watching him. His gaze softened after a moment, and he looked at me with something like confusion, as if he'd just snapped out of a trance. But in the dim light of the room, I noticed something else, a faint but distinct scratch on the wall, right where he'd been staring. I leaned in to examine it. It was tiny, almost invisible, but definitely there, 3 parallel scratches etched into the paint, too thin for claws, too straight to be accidental. I ran my fingers over them, feeling the roughness. They hadn't been there before. I was certain of it. The next morning, I woke up groggy, my head pounding. My first instinct was to reach over and grab my phone, but when I rolled over, I found myself face to face with a small pile of gravel on my pillow. My stomach dropped. I sat up, staring at it in confusion. There was no possible way gravel could have ended up there. My bedroom was on the second floor, windows closed. I slowly picked up a piece, rolling it between my fingers. It felt real sharp. I dropped it back onto the bed and immediately stripped the sheets, searching for some logical explanation, but there was none. I spent the whole day at work in a daze, running on autopilot. I felt eyes on me everywhere I went, like something was watching me just out of sight. My coworkers noticed too, asking if I was okay, but I waved them off, unwilling to admit that my life felt like it was fraying at the edges. When I got home that night, I found Max staring at the wall again, this time in the kitchen. I moved closer, bracing myself, expecting another growl, but he simply glanced at me with a forlorn look and went back to his vigil. There on the wall were 3 fresh scratches, just like the ones in the living room. This time, they were longer, deeper, almost cutting through the drywall. I traced them with my fingers, feeling a chill creep up my spine. In bed that night, I couldn't sleep. Every shadow felt sinister, every creak in the house loud and full of intention. Around midnight, I heard soft footsteps, but not from Max. These were heavier, slower, as if someone was pacing in the hallway outside my door. I held my breath, waiting, clutching my blanket. The footsteps stopped. I felt the presence of someone or something standing just on the other side of the door. I sat up, trying to shake off the terror. "This is ridiculous," I whispered to myself. But then, the handle on my bedroom door turned slowly, as if someone were testing it. I froze, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it was echoing in the room. The handle stopped, and after a long, unbearable silence, the footsteps retreated down the hall. The next day, I tried to convince myself it was a dream, that my mind was playing tricks. But when I went to brush my teeth, I saw it, faint scratches along the bathroom mirror, 3 parallel lines. My reflection stared back at me, a pale, terrified version of myself. And in that moment, I realized I couldn't ignore it any longer. I tried to tell a friend, but it sounded ridiculous the moment the words left my mouth. Scratches on the wall, gravel on my pillow, a dog who stared at things that weren't there. It all sounded like the plot of a bad horror movie. My friend laughed it off, telling me I was probably just sleepwalking, maybe even messing with myself without realizing it. But her laughter felt like it came from far away, muffled, as if I were already slipping away from the world I knew. That night, I couldn't bring myself to go to bed. I sat on the couch, Max curled up beside me, watching the shadows dance across the room. At some point, I must have drifted off, because when I opened my eyes, it was still dark and Max was gone. I looked around, disoriented, my heart sinking. I called his name, but the house was silent. I stood up, my legs shaking, and noticed the door to the basement was open, a door that I never ever left open. It was pitch black beyond the threshold, a darkness so complete it felt like it was swallowing the light from the hallway. I approached slowly, peering down the stairs, but I couldn't see anything beyond the first step. The air was thick and cold, and I hesitated, telling myself I could just close the door, go back to the couch, pretend none of this was happening. But then I heard it, a faint scratching coming from the bottom of the stairs. 3 long, deliberate scratches. I took a step back, my hand gripping the doorframe. My instinct screamed to run, but some invisible pull kept me rooted there, watching. The scratching grew louder, closer, climbing the stairs step by step. And then I saw them. 3 parallel scratches slowly etching themselves into the wood on each step as they ascended, like invisible claws dragging their way up to me. Max barked, a loud, panic sound that shattered the silence, and I turned to see him standing behind me, his hackles raised, teeth bared at the darkness. His eyes flicked between me and the basement door, as if urging me to run, to get away. I didn't need any more convincing. I grabbed my keys, bolted out the front door with Max at my side, and didn't stop until we reached my car. I could still hear the scratching in my ears, even as I drove away, and when I glanced back at the house, I thought I saw a figure standing in the doorway, a shadow, tall and unmoving, watching me with empty eyes. I never went back. I packed what I could the next day with a friend's help, never going in alone, never opening any doors we didn't have to. To this day, I have no idea what was scratching its way through my walls, etching itself into my life piece by piece. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, I hear it again, 3 slow, deliberate scratches in the quiet, reminding me that it's still out there, waiting, watching. And I don't know if it will ever stop. I was working late one night, finishing up a project I put off all week. The office was dead quiet, empty rows of cubicles fading into shadows. I loved working late, honestly. There was a strange peace to it, and I got so much more done without the background noise of people talking, phones ringing, or the steady click-clack of keyboards. Just as I was wrapping things up, I got a message on my computer screen. "Do you feel it?" I frowned, staring at the message box. There was no sender information, No notification sound, just those 3 words hanging there. It must have been some weird glitch in the company's messaging software. Or maybe one of the IT guys was playing around. I ignored it, shut down my computer, and grabbed my bag to head out. As I walked toward the elevators, I felt a prickling at the back of my neck like someone was watching me. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing in the dimly lit office. But there was no one, just rows of empty desks and the distant hum of the HVAC system. I told myself I was just tired, maybe a bit on edge from the weird message. But that feeling stayed with me, making me feel off. The elevator finally arrived and I stepped in, pressing the button for the lobby. The doors began to close, and just before they shut completely, I saw it. A faint figure standing at the end of the hall. Just an outline, barely visible in the low light. My heart skipped a beat as the doors closed, sealing me off from whatever or whoever it was. In the lobby, the security guard was nowhere to be seen. Usually, he'd nod or give me a quick wave as I walked out, but tonight there was just an eerie silence. I chalked it up to him being on a break and pushed through the revolving doors into the cool night air. As I made my way to the parking lot, I felt a strange sense of déjà vu, like I'd done this exact walk 1,000 times before. Which, okay, technically I had, it was my daily routine, but this felt different. It felt like every detail was exactly the same as it had been the night before and the night before that. The same wind, the same distant sound of traffic, even the same car parked slightly askew in the lot. I reached my car and froze. My phone had buzzed in my pocket, just as it had last night and the night before. I checked the screen. It was a text message from an unknown number. Do you feel it? I glanced around the empty parking lot, half expecting someone to jump out of the shadows, laughing at a prank. But there was no one. I felt the hair on my arms rise, my skin prickling with a mix of dread and curiosity. My fingers hovered over my phone, but I didn't respond. Instead, I shoved the phone back into my pocket, got in my car, and locked the doors. The drive home was uneventful, but that message stayed on my mind. When I finally pulled into my driveway, my house looked strange, just the faintest bit wrong, like the lights in the windows weren't quite in the right places. I chalked it up to my nerves and went inside. The next morning, everything felt normal again. I almost laughed at myself, thinking I'd just let my imagination get the better of me. But when I got to work and sat down at my desk, I noticed something strange. My computer was already on. I never left it on overnight. I was compulsive about shutting it down. The message box was still open, the words staring back at me. Do you feel it? The hairs on my neck prickled again, but I forced myself to ignore it, clicking the message box closed. It was probably just a random glitch, maybe a message loop from a software bug. I threw myself into work, trying to shake the feeling of unease that had been building for days. At lunch, I headed down to the lobby to get some fresh air. But when I stepped out of the elevator, I froze. The lobby was dark, empty, almost as if it had been abandoned. The lights were off, casting strange, elongated shadows across the floor. I looked around, expecting to see someone, anyone, but there was no one there. Just the distant hum of machinery and the faint echo of my footsteps. And then, that text came through again. Do you feel it? This time, I replied. Who is this? I typed, my hands shaking. I stood there, waiting, my eyes darting around the dim lobby, hoping that someone, anyone, would appear and tell me this was all some ridiculous joke. A reply came almost instantly. You almost there? I felt like I was going crazy. What did that even mean? Almost where? I stepped outside, half wondering if this was all some vivid nightmare, but the cold air hit me, grounding me. I pulled out my phone to call someone, anyone, just to hear a voice that might reassure me that I was awake, that I was real. But there was no signal, not even a single bar. I checked the time on my phone, and that was wrong too. It was frozen at exactly 1:13 p.m., even though I knew it had to be past 2. I turned my phone off and on, but when it came back on, the time was still 1:13, and the same message was staring back at me. You're almost there. I decided I needed to go back upstairs, to pack up my things and get out of the building. But when I stepped back into the elevator, I had this sinking feeling that I was about to find something I didn't want to see. The ride up felt longer than usual, like the elevator was rising at a crawl. When the doors opened, I stepped into the hallway and immediately noticed that something was wrong. Every single door was open. Offices, conference rooms, even the closets. They were all wide open, and every single desk was empty, papers neatly stacked, as if everyone had packed up and left in a hurry. The air was thick with silence, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking through a ghost town. I walked to my desk, half expecting it to be untouched, but everything was gone. The papers, my coffee mug, even my computer, it was all missing like I'd never worked there. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, already dreading what I'd see. The text message was there, one last line. "You're here." I felt the world shift around me, like the floor was tilting, the walls stretching. I ran to the windows, hoping to see the city below, but there was nothing. Just a dense fog stretching out as far as I could see, like I was floating in some kind of blank, featureless space. Panic clawed at me, but I couldn't scream. I couldn't even breathe. It was like the building had been severed from the world, left drifting in a void. Then I heard footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I turned, but there was no one there. Just the echoes of steps that stopped right at my desk, like someone was standing there, watching me. The air grew thick, almost oppressive, and I could feel something just beyond the edge of my vision. Something enormous, something that filled every shadow, waiting. My phone buzzed one last time, the screen lighting up with a new message. This one was different. Look closely. I felt an overwhelming urge to stare at my hands. They looked normal at first, but as I kept looking, they started to blur at the edges like pixels glitching in and out of focus. I touched my own fingers, and my skin felt strange, like it wasn't solid, more like static, like I could pass right through it if I tried. My heart pounded as I realized that I was starting to fade, dissolving into the same fog that had swallowed everything else. And then I understood I was never actually here. None of this was real. The office, the city, even the people I saw every day. It was all some simulation, some half-formed echo of a life I thought I had. I could feel myself unraveling, every memory, every feeling slipping away like sand through my fingers. I felt an odd sense of calm as I faded. Maybe that was why they kept asking, "Do you feel it?" I hadn't been able to feel it. Not really, not until it was too late. Whatever I had been was dissolving into the static, and I couldn't stop it. In the last moments, I caught a glimpse of something. Someone standing over me, watching as I faded. They had no face, just a pair of eyes, bright and endless, observing me with a detached curiosity. And then, everything went dark. When I opened my eyes, I was sitting at my desk, staring at my computer screen. The clock read 8:12 a.m., and my coffee was steaming next to me, just as I left it. The office was bustling with people arriving for the day. Everything was normal again, except out of the corner of my eye, I could still see that shadowy figure standing by the elevator, watching. It started at a bookstore, one of those little places tucked into a side street, dimly lit and filled with the musty scent of yellowing pages. I had no intention of stopping in, just happened to glance at the display window while on my way to grab lunch. But then I saw it. An old book, thick and bound in a faded, dark green cover. The title was barely visible, stamped in gold, with strange, swirling letters that seemed to rearrange themselves every time I looked away. I couldn't explain it, but I felt an overwhelming urge to go inside, as if the book itself were calling me. The store was empty, except for an older man sitting behind the counter. He barely looked up as I entered. I felt self-conscious, as though I were intruding on something private, but the pull toward the book was stronger. I walked over to the display and reached for it, feeling a sudden jolt when my fingers touched the cover, like a mild electric shock. Before I knew it, I was at the counter with the book in my hand, pulling out my wallet. The old man looked at me with an odd smile as he rang it up, like he'd been waiting for me. He didn't say a word, and neither did I. I just handed him cash, took the book, and left, heart pounding for reasons I couldn't explain. I started reading that night, curled up on the couch, the book heavy in my hands. The story was strange, written in a style I didn't recognize, with sentences that meandered, almost dreamlike, as if they were part of a foggy memory. It wasn't what I'd call a plot exactly, Rather, it was a series of entries from the perspective of a nameless character wandering through different lives, different times. Each entry seemed to end abruptly, right when the character began to realize something wasn't right. Hours passed without me noticing. By the time I looked up, it was past midnight, and I felt heavy, disoriented, like I'd just emerged from a long sleep. I set the book down, intending to finish it the next day, and went to bed. But that night, I dreamed in a way I never had before. In the dream, I was walking down a street I didn't recognize, lined with identical houses, each one painted a different, muted shade. The street was empty, silent, except for one house with a light on. I felt drawn to it. That same magnetic pull I'd felt with the book, and without even realizing it, I was standing at the door, hand hovering over the doorknob. When I woke up, the memory of the dream lingered, sharp and vivid, like it had really happened. I went through the day in a daze, feeling a strange, nagging urge to go back to the book. That evening, I picked it up again, flipping through the pages to where I'd left off. I noticed something odd right away. One of the entries had changed. The words were different from the ones I'd read the night before. The nameless character was now describing a street lined with identical houses, a light on in one of them, and the feeling of standing at a door, about to go inside. My skin prickled with an uneasy familiarity. As I read, I felt the words sink into my mind, as if the story were embedding itself into my memory. Each entry seemed closer to something I couldn't quite place, as though it were mapping out a story I'd lived before but couldn't remember. And each time I stopped reading, I'd find myself caught in more strange, half-familiar dreams. On the third night, the dream returned, but this time, I opened the door. Inside was a hallway, dimly lit, with walls lined with old, sepia-toned photographs. Each photo was slightly blurred, as if the subjects had moved just as the picture was taken, their faces obscured. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps silent, feeling like I was trespassing. The air was thick, almost stifling, as if the house itself were watching me. At the end of the hallway, I found a door with a strange symbol carved into the wood, a circle intersected by a jagged line. The sight of it filled me with an overwhelming sense of dread, but I couldn't stop myself. I reached out and pushed the door open, and then I was awake, back in my bed, heart pounding. But the sensation didn't fade with the morning light. All day, I felt a lingering presence, as though someone had followed me out of the dream. I tried to shake it off, convinced it was just my mind playing tricks, but that night, when I opened the book, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The entry had changed again. It now described a nameless character walking down a dim hallway lined with photographs, reaching a door with a circle and jagged line carved into it. The words felt heavy, pressing down on me as I read, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the story was no longer just fiction. It was documenting my own life, my own dreams. Or maybe it was the other way around, that my life was somehow becoming the story. I stopped reading, closed the book, and shoved it into a drawer, hoping to forget about it. But over the next few days, reality itself began to feel unstable, as though it were fraying at the edges. I'd see flickers out of the corner of my eye, a shadow passing, a face in a window that vanished when I looked directly at it. I'd hear faint whispers too, barely audible like voices just out of reach. And every night, the dream returned, leading me further into that strange house, down that endless hallway. One evening, unable to resist, I pulled the book out again. But when I opened it, the pages were blank. I flipped through, one by one, heart racing, but every single page was empty, as if the story had never been there. I felt a deep, inexplicable panic, like I'd lost something vital, something I couldn't live without. The silence in my apartment felt thick, oppressive, like the air itself was holding its breath. Then I noticed something, the symbol from the door in my dream, faint but visible, etched into the inside cover of the book. I ran my fingers over it, feeling a faint indentation. As soon as I touched it, a wave of dizziness washed over me. My vision blurred, and I felt myself sinking, falling into a dark, quiet place. When I came to, I was in the hallway, the one from my dream, with the same dim light, the same sepia-toned photographs on the walls. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me, and somewhere, deep in the back of my mind, I knew I wasn't dreaming anymore. I was in the house. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I turned and ran back the way I'd come, but the hallway stretched on, twisting and turning in impossible ways, like a maze with no exit. My heart pounded, panic rising as I realized that no matter how far I ran, I was always exactly where I'd started. Finally, I stopped, exhausted, leaning against the wall to catch my breath. That's when I saw it, a photograph hanging in front of me, clearer than the others. It was of me, standing in that same hallway, looking terrified, staring back at the camera as though I'd been caught in the act of realizing something terrible. And beside me, in the background of the photo, was the old man from the bookstore, watching me with that same knowing smile. The realization hit me like ice. This place, this hallway, this endless loop, it wasn't just part of the book. It was the book, and I was inside it now. Part of the story, just another nameless character wandering its pages. I don't know how long I've been here. Time doesn't work the same way in this place. Sometimes I hear whispers, faint and distant, voices of people I almost remember calling my name. But each time I try to reach them, the hallway stretches further, the door at the end receding into darkness. And every so often, I catch a glimpse of myself in the photographs lining the walls, older or younger, or wearing clothes I don't remember owning. Each version of me looks a little more lost, a little more hollow, as if pieces of me are scattered across each frame, each one trapped in the story I can't escape. I am the story now, and the book? It's out there, waiting for someone else to pick it up. I wonder who will read my entry next. The thing is, I never saw it coming, not in a million years. Lana and I had been together for nearly a decade, and I honestly thought we were one of those couples. You know, the ones people look at and say, yeah, they'll make it. And up until last year, I would have bet anything on that. I'd always trusted her, completely, without hesitation. It sounds naive now, but that's how sure I was. She was my best friend, my partner, the one person who knew me better than anyone else. Or so I thought. Things started to change in these tiny, almost invisible ways. I'd catch her smiling at her phone, or she'd disappear into the other room to take a call. I told myself I was overthinking it. Everyone has work stuff they don't want to talk about, right? Besides, she'd always been someone who needed her space, and I loved that about her. We respected each other's independence. It was one of the cornerstones of our relationship, so I let it go. But then there was that weekend in August. We planned a trip to the mountains, just the two of us. We both loved hiking, and it had been a while since we'd done something just for us. But the night before we were supposed to leave, she suddenly had to work. I remember looking at her, trying to read her expression, but she was perfectly calm, telling me she'd have to reschedule because there was some last-minute project. "You go," she said, smiling in that way that used to make me feel like the luckiest guy in the world. "Take some time for yourself. You work too hard anyway." The thing was, her calmness struck me as odd. Lana hated missing out on things like this. We'd planned this trip together, and she'd been looking forward to it as much as I had. But now she seemed almost relieved. I pushed it to the back of my mind, deciding it was just work stress, and headed out to the mountains alone, spending most of the trip trying to shake a feeling I couldn't quite name. Things just kept getting stranger after that. One night, she came home hours late from dinner with the girls, and she'd obviously had a few drinks. She looked surprised, almost guilty, to see me still awake. I made a joke about her going wild, but she just laughed it off and slipped into the shower without a word. I sat there in bed, listening to the water run, and I remember thinking something's off, but I convinced myself I was just being paranoid. The turning point came on a random Tuesday night. She was working late again, and I decided to surprise her at the office with her favorite takeout. I figured it'd be a nice gesture, maybe give us a moment to reconnect. But when I got there, the building was practically deserted. Her office was dark, and her desk was empty. I called her, and she answered on the first ring, her voice sounding surprised and a bit nervous. "I'm still here," she said quickly before adding, "I was just taking a quick break outside." I waited near her car in the parking lot, feeling my heart pound like I was about to do something wrong. After a few minutes, she came around the corner, visibly startled to see me there. She forced a smile, but something in her eyes didn't match it. She hugged me, her movements stiff and awkward, and I felt like I was hugging a stranger. We went home, and for the first time in our relationship, I found myself wanting to check her phone. I knew her passcode. It was an old joke between us that we'd use each other's birthdays as codes, but now it felt like an invasion. After she fell asleep, I grabbed her phone, hesitating, fingers hovering over the screen. But then, as if sensing something, she stirred beside me, and I quickly set it down. My heart was racing, and I felt sick with guilt, but also with this gut-wrenching suspicion that wouldn't go away. A week later, I finally let myself give in. She'd left her phone on the kitchen counter while she was in the shower, and I opened it, feeling like a criminal. I went straight to her messages, half hoping to find nothing, but there it was, a string of texts with a contact saved as Ava, which was strange because I didn't know anyone named Ava. The messages weren't intense. They weren't explicit, but the words were heavy, the kind that only come out when there's something more than friendship. Things like, "I can't stop thinking about last night," and "When will I see you again?" I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. I scrolled up, trying to find the beginning, but the thread had been carefully edited. The first message was only a few weeks old, and it was clear that every earlier message had been deleted. I closed the phone and stared at it, feeling hollow, numb, angry all at once. I didn't confront her right away. Instead, I watched. I paid attention to every little thing. How she'd get home late more often, the constant phone checking, the nights she'd laugh at jokes I wasn't in on. It was like living in a warped reality where I could see everything falling apart, but she was completely unaware. And I knew that if I brought it up, she'd either lie or shut down, just like she had that night in the parking lot. It took me 2 months to finally confront her. I waited until she came home one night, looking a bit too happy, a bit too relaxed. She went to put her things down, and I said, "Who's Ava?" The words came out cold, almost detached, but inside, I was shaking. She froze, her back to me, and for a split second, I saw her shoulders drop, as if she'd been expecting this moment, but had hoped it would never come. She turned around, and her face was unreadable, her expression carefully blank. "Just someone from work," she said, her voice too smooth, too controlled. I could tell she was scrambling, searching for an answer that would explain everything without admitting to anything. But I didn't need to hear more. I knew the truth, and deep down, so did she. I told her to get her things and leave. She didn't fight, didn't argue or plead, just packed up her essentials in silence, avoiding my gaze the whole time. Watching her walk out the door felt like ripping out a part of myself, but I couldn't bear to keep pretending. After she left, I found myself wandering around the apartment, touching the things she'd left behind, like somehow they'd give me the answers I was looking for. Her scent still lingered on her pillow. Her favorite coffee mug was still on the counter, and it felt as if she was somehow still there, a ghost haunting the life we'd built together. The worst part was realizing how long I'd been blind to the signs, how easily I'd accepted her excuses because I didn't want to believe the truth. It's strange, the things we'll tell ourselves to keep the illusion intact. But now the illusion was shattered, and all I had left were questions and memories, echoes of a life that no longer existed. Months went by, and I gradually found myself again, piece by piece. I learned to trust my instincts, to listen to that quiet voice that I'd ignored for so long. Lana became a story I only shared in bits and pieces, the pain fading into something softer, something that didn't burn quite as much. I'll always wonder why she chose to lie instead of telling me the truth, but I know now that it wasn't about me. It was supposed to be an ordinary night. I was house-sitting for my friend Lucy, who lives in this cozy but secluded house at the edge of town. She'd asked me to look after her dog, Jasper, for a weekend while she visited her family. I agreed, mostly because Lucy's place is 10 times nicer than my tiny apartment, and Jasper is an easygoing, fluffy golden retriever. I thought I'd spend a couple of nights watching movies, making snacks, and relaxing. The house itself was comfortable, but isolated. No neighbors close by, just fields and forests stretching out in all directions. There was only one main road leading out of town, and Lucy's house was at the end of it. right before the field started. I drove there Friday afternoon, watched a couple of shows, and went to bed early, lulled to sleep by the quiet that's so rare in the city. Around 2 a.m., Jasper started barking from somewhere downstairs. Now, this dog was chill to the point of being lazy, so hearing him bark was strange. Half asleep, I thought maybe he'd just heard an animal outside. But as I lay there, blinking up at the ceiling, I realized the barking was becoming more frantic. I got out of bed, rubbing my eyes, and made my way down the narrow staircase. The house was pitch black except for the small green glow of the digital clock on the microwave. I reached the bottom of the stairs and saw Jasper standing in the middle of the living room, staring at the front door, still barking. His tail was stiff, and the fur along his spine was bristling, which was totally out of character for him. I reached out and touched his head, whispering, "What's up, boy? What is it?" He whimpered and pressed his body against me, which made my heart skip a beat. Something was definitely off. I glanced out the window next to the door, trying to spot anything unusual, but there was nothing, just darkness and a sliver of moonlight. I shook it off, figured maybe he'd heard an animal outside, and led him back to his bed. After a few minutes, Jasper settled down, and I went back to sleep. But barely an hour later, he was barking again, this time louder, more desperate. I jumped out of bed and raced downstairs, my heart pounding. The feeling in the air was different now. There was an odd stillness, like even the wind had stopped moving. This time, Jasper wasn't looking at the front door. He was staring at the back door, a sliding glass door that opened up to the fields. As I walked closer, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a figure standing outside, just beyond the glass, almost completely hidden in the shadows. I couldn't make out any details, but whoever it was, they were just standing there, perfectly still. "Hello?" I called, my voice coming out shakier than I'd intended. No response. They didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there, a dark silhouette in the night. Jasper kept barking, and his usually friendly nature had vanished. He looked ready to lunge through the glass. I reached for my phone, ready to call the police, but my hand froze when the figure finally moved. He, or it was definitely a man from his build, took a step forward just enough for me to see his face in the moonlight. He wore this strange, unsettling smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. He looked unhinged, like he knew he wasn't supposed to be there, but that was exactly why he was. "What do you want?" I shouted, holding my phone tightly, finger poised over the call button. He tilted his head, still grinning, and brought a finger to his lips, as if to shush me. Jasper barked louder, pressing his body closer to mine. I'd never seen him so riled up, so aggressive. I took a step back, my heart hammering, and then, in one swift motion, the man sprinted across the backyard, disappearing into the fields. I didn't wait for him to come back. I grabbed Jasper by the collar, dashed up the stairs, and locked myself in the bedroom, heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it even from outside. I dialed 911, whispering my location as I clutched Jasper, his trembling body pressed close to mine. The police arrived within 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. They combed through the fields, the yard, but found nothing. No footprints, no signs of anyone at all. They told me it was probably some drifter passing through, maybe someone trying to scare me. They offered to keep a patrol car nearby, just in case, but I could see in their faces they didn't think he'd come back. The officer in charge assured me the area was safe, and I forced myself to believe him. I managed to get back to sleep just before dawn, though every little sound made me jump. Jasper slept curled up against me, his usually relaxed posture replaced with a guarded stance. I was exhausted by morning, but convinced myself it was over. I went about the day as normally as I could, and by evening, I was almost feeling back to normal. I tried to brush off the whole thing as just some freak incident. But that night, around the same time, 2 a.m., just like before, I heard something that made my blood turn to ice. Someone was tapping on the glass downstairs. Not knocking, not banging, just a steady, rhythmic tap. I didn't want to go down, didn't want to see what was waiting for me, but something in me had to know. I crept down the stairs, Jasper beside me, his ears alert, his stance protective. As I reached the bottom step, I froze. He was back, standing at the back door, tapping his fingernails against the glass. His smile was even wider this time, a twisted grin that made my stomach churn. Jasper growled low, his hackles raised, but the man didn't flinch. He just kept tapping, his eyes fixed on mine. I fumbled for my phone again, but before I could call for help, he stopped tapping and raised his hand, pointing one finger at me. Then, in a slow, deliberate motion, he traced an invisible line across his throat, never breaking eye contact. The message was clear. He turned and disappeared back into the fields before I could react, vanishing into the night just as the headlights from the patrol car swept up the driveway. The officers took my statement again, but there was nothing they could do. No footprints, no evidence. It was like he was a ghost. They assured me that they'd keep a closer watch, but I could tell they thought I was just paranoid. Lucy returned the next day, and I told her everything, my voice trembling with each detail. She was horrified, but didn't seem surprised. Her face went pale, and she admitted, reluctantly, that a few years back, she'd had a similar experience, seeing someone lurking outside at night, tapping on the glass. She'd assumed it was just some drunk wandering through, but hearing my story, she wasn't so sure. We both moved on, or tried to, but sometimes, late at night, I'll wake up to the sound of tapping, only to realize it's just my imagination. Or at least I hope it is. But whenever I visit Lucy, I make sure the doors are locked tight and the curtains are drawn. And I can't shake the feeling that whoever he was, he's still out there, waiting, watching for the next time someone is alone in that house at the edge of town. One Sunday, just before Christmas, I found myself standing in front of a tree that I hadn't planned to buy. I was at a grocery store, supposed to be grabbing eggs and laundry detergent, when I saw it. It was an end-of-season reject, shoved into the farthest corner of the display, leaning at a sad angle with a few scraggly branches sticking out in odd places. It looked a bit pathetic, and yet something about it made me stop. Maybe it was the fact that the holiday was just a week away, and I hadn't felt a single ounce of holiday spirit since December started. I'd spent most of the month skipping invites, ignoring festive music, and pretending the season wasn't even happening. This year had been tough. My first year alone after the breakup, trying to figure out bills, work, and how to be alone without feeling, well, lonely. The last thing I wanted was to pretend like I was celebrating. But here I was standing in the aisle, looking at this hopeless little tree like it was calling me by name. "What do you think?" a voice behind me asked. I turned to see a little girl, probably no older than 8, looking up at me with serious eyes, her little gloved hand clutching a candy cane. Her mother stood a few steps behind, checking her phone, oblivious to her daughter's curiosity. I looked at the girl and shrugged, a little embarrassed to be caught staring. "It's different," I said, as if it were a real conversation. She cocked her head, studying the tree with the careful eye of an art critic. "I like it. It's kind of weird." She turned to me, eyes wide, waiting for confirmation. "Yeah," I agreed, laughing a little. "Weird, but interesting." She nodded, very pleased with this conclusion, and ran back to her mother. I glanced back at the tree, feeling a strange pang of attachment. In some bizarre way, it seemed to mirror my own life, slightly off balance, missing a few important parts, but still here, still standing. Before I knew it, the tree was in my cart. I rolled it up to the checkout, where the cashier gave me a skeptical look. "Half off," she said, her eyebrows raised, like she was expecting me to change my mind. "No, it's fine," I replied, fishing out my wallet. It felt like I was making a commitment, however absurd. I wheeled it out to my car, awkwardly loaded it into the trunk, and drove home with it sliding around in the back. In my apartment, I cleared a space for it by the window. My little place wasn't exactly designed for holiday decor, but I somehow managed to squeeze the tree in without knocking anything over. I stepped back, took a look, and realized just how scrappy it looked without any ornaments or lights. For a second, I wondered if this whole thing had been a mistake, if the little girl's enthusiasm had tricked me into dragging home a broken holiday promise. But I'd already gone this far. So, I rummaged through a box in the closet and pulled out the lights and decorations I'd thrown in there last year, certain I wouldn't need them again. As I started winding the lights around the branches, I found myself humming along to a Christmas song, playing faintly from my neighbor's apartment. I'd avoided holiday music all month, but somehow tonight it felt okay. I wasn't exactly feeling jolly, but the lights made the tree look a little less sad, and as I hung a few old ornaments, a few memories started surfacing. Mom's favorite glass angel, the handmade star that I'd made in grade school, a funny little squirrel ornament from a friend back in college. Each decoration was like a small piece of my past, all layered and wrapped around this awkward little tree. When I stepped back to look at it, I actually smiled. The lights cast a warm, soft glow in my living room, the colors reflecting off the window in gentle hues. The tree didn't look perfect. It was lopsided, missing patches and leaning to one side, but it was kind of beautiful in its own way. Just as I was admiring my handiwork, my phone buzzed with a text from an old friend, someone I hadn't talked to in months. "Hey, random question," it read, "but do you still have that squirrel ornament I gave you back in the day?" The timing was eerie. I held the phone in one hand and looked at the little squirrel ornament in the other, its goofy, painted smile and big acorn sitting proudly on a branch near the top of the tree. I quickly snapped a picture and sent it back to her with a simple "Yep, still here." Almost immediately, the phone rang, and her name lit up on the screen. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I was ready to talk to anyone. But tonight, something felt different. I picked up. "Oh my God, you still have it," she exclaimed as soon as I answered. "Of course," I said, trying to sound casual. "I wouldn't get rid of something like that." She laughed, and soon we were deep into a conversation about all the ridiculous things we'd done back in college, how life had changed since then, and what we were up to now. There was an ease in her voice, a warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. By the time we hung up, I felt lighter, like a little piece of the weight I'd been carrying had lifted. After that call, I sent a few other texts, reaching out to people I hadn't talked to in a while. Some of them didn't reply, but others did. And soon my phone was buzzing with little messages, small connections that felt like sparks against the darkness. Each one reminded me that, even though life had changed, some things remained. There were still people out there who remembered me, who cared. I sat down on the couch, looking at the tree, and for the first time all month, I felt a bit of real holiday spirit. The tree wasn't perfect, and neither was I. But maybe that didn't matter. Maybe the holiday didn't need to be filled with perfection. Just moments, fragments of light in the midst of everything else. That night, I fell asleep with the glow of the tree filling the room. And as I drifted off, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. A sense of peace, like everything didn't have to be put together for it to be okay. In the morning, the tree still leaned to one side, looking as scrappy as ever, but somehow that made it even better. It was like a reflection of all the imperfect things I'd finally decided to embrace. It started when I found the postcard. It was on my dresser, propped up against my old alarm clock, a bright, cheerful thing with a glossy beach scene on one side and a few short lines scribbled in pen on the other. The weird thing was I didn't know where it came from. I lived alone, kept my doors locked, and wasn't expecting any mail. The postmark was smudged, the handwriting unfamiliar. But it was addressed to me, right down to my apartment number. The message was strange. "We're so glad you're here. Let's make some memories. You're friends." I laughed it off. I didn't have friends who would prank me like this. In fact, I didn't have many friends at all, having just moved here a few months ago. Still, I kept it propped on my dresser as a quirky mystery. The next morning, another one appeared. This one was a photo of a rustic-looking diner, empty booths, and a neon sign flickering in the window. The caption read, "Breakfast special, blueberry pancakes, your favorite." I frowned. Blueberry pancakes were my favorite. I'd mentioned it once to my boss during a lunch meeting, but otherwise, I'd never told anyone around here. I flipped the card over. This one just had a simple sentence, "See you soon." A chill ran down my spine, but I shrugged it off. Small towns were known for oddities, right? Maybe it was a local marketing stunt, some weird new attempt to get people out to their businesses. But still, I kept the postcard. There was something about it that was too unsettling to throw away. On the third day, there was a knock on my door just before dawn, before the sun had even risen. I stumbled out of bed, bleary-eyed, expecting maybe a package or a neighbor needing something. But there was no one there, just another postcard left on the mat outside. This one showed a little cabin surrounded by woods, the sort you'd see on a postcard rack in a souvenir shop. The message read, "A weekend getaway awaits you. Come find us." Okay, now I was really freaked out. I scanned the hallway, searching for anyone who might be pulling a prank, but the corridor was empty and still. I went back inside, double-locking the door, my skin crawling with a kind of dread I couldn't shake. I didn't go to work that day. I spent hours trying to track down who might be sending these postcards, looking up every nearby diner, cabin, and tourist attraction I could find online. None of the photos matched anything in the area. When I called a few of the businesses, asking if they'd sent any marketing, they sounded baffled. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I could feel a heaviness settling over me, an overwhelming sense of being watched. Every creak, every distant sound made me jump. Sleep was elusive, and when I finally drifted off, I dreamed I was standing in that empty diner, looking out the window into a thick wall of mist. I could hear people whispering, but I couldn't see anyone. I jolted awake, my heart pounding. It was morning, and there, sitting on the kitchen counter, was another postcard. I hadn't even heard anyone come in. This one was an image of a strange little town, like something out of a storybook, with quaint shops, narrow streets, and a towering clock that read 6:07, even though the sky looked like twilight. The caption, "Come to the place where time stands still." I sat down, the air in my apartment feeling stale and oppressive, the walls closing in. My head spun with possibilities. Had I told anyone about moving here? Did someone know my habits, my interests? I started thinking back to the grocery store clerk, the guy at the coffee shop, even my boss. Had any of them been acting strange? Who was I really talking to every day? That evening, I walked around town, paranoid, scanning every face for a hint of recognition. But people looked at me as they always did, just polite nods or blank stares. I tried to bring it up casually with my boss, mentioning how weird it was that strangers could get your address. He just shrugged and laughed it off. "Small towns, right?" he said with a grin that somehow seemed a little too wide. I went home, feeling defeated. That night, I locked every door, checked every window, even moved my dresser in front of the bedroom door just for peace of mind. When I woke up the next morning, my room was quiet, almost too quiet. And there, on the pillow next to mine, was the next postcard. This time, there was no cheerful image. It was a blank, black background with a single message scrawled in the same familiar handwriting. "No need to hide, Ava. We're already with you." My heart pounded so loud I could barely think. I was certain I'd locked everything. I picked up the postcard, my hands shaking, and flipped it over. On the back was the drawing of a little house with lights glowing from every window. The caption read, "Come home." I didn't stay in the apartment after that. I grabbed my car keys and left, not even stopping to pack anything. I drove for hours, desperate to escape, feeling that thick dread follow me all the way out of town. I stayed in a cheap motel on the edge of a neighboring city, where I finally managed to catch my breath, staring up at the peeling ceiling, wondering how my life had spiraled so quickly into fear. But the next morning, when I opened the door, there it was on the mat outside my room. Another postcard. This one showed a narrow, winding road leading into dark, towering trees. "You can't run from home," it said. I drove again, going as far as I could, even contemplating crossing state lines. But every time I stopped, there was a postcard waiting on the doorstep inside my car on the sink of a gas station bathroom. No matter where I went, they found me, and each one was blank on one side now, just black with that same message, "Come home." After a week, exhausted and barely able to think straight, I finally turned back. It felt like something was pulling me, an invisible thread tugging at my mind, pulling me back to the town, back to my apartment where I arrived late in the evening, feeling more like a shadow than myself. The door was unlocked when I got there, swinging open like it had been expecting me. I stepped inside, the dim light from the hallway casting long shadows across the walls. As I closed the door behind me, I noticed the postcards. They were everywhere, scattered across every surface, taped to walls, lying in stacks on the floor. Each one had a different image. A beach, a diner, a cabin in the woods, a dark, endless road, and each one bore the same two words, "Welcome home." I turned around, ready to leave again, but the door wouldn't budge. My hands shook as I pulled on the handle, but it felt solid as steel. I felt a prickling down my spine, a cold presence creeping closer, filling the room like a dark fog. When I finally turned back, I saw them. Faces in the dark, shadowy figures standing just out of reach, their eyes gleaming with something that wasn't quite human. They watched me in silence, unmoving, the darkness pooling around them. My head spun, heart pounding as they whispered in a low, rumbling chorus. "You've always belonged here." I stumbled back, pressing myself against the door, unable to look away. The air felt thick, pressing down on me, every sound muffled by that oppressive, suffocating silence. And then, one by one, they began to smile. I was staying with my uncle for the summer, working odd jobs at his little general store on the edge of town. He was a quiet guy, the sort of person who could go hours without saying a word, just nodding and occasionally pointing out tasks I could help with. The shop was one of those small-town relics. Dusty shelves lined with everything from tools and fishing gear to canned food and faded postcards of local landmarks. On slow days, I'd sit behind the counter, listening to the hum of the ancient ceiling fan and the occasional buzz of flies bumping against the screen door. It was on one of those lazy afternoons that he told me about the Lost Isle. "What's that?" I asked, more to break the silence than out of genuine curiosity. My uncle scratched his chin, eyes fixed on the wall behind me, as if remembering something distant. "It's, well, not a place exactly," he murmured. "More like a glitch." That got my attention. I laughed, thinking he was pulling my leg. "What do you mean a glitch? Like in the store?" He nodded slowly. "It's only there when it wants to be, you see. Happens in old places sometimes, older than they seem. You might be in the middle of aisle 4, looking for canned peaches, and you'll turn around, and you're not where you started." I snorted. "Sure, okay." But he was dead serious, his gaze distant, as if he was trying to explain something that didn't quite fit into words. People have wandered into it, gotten confused, found themselves back out without remembering where they'd been. But some of them, he trailed off, scratching his chin again, that faraway look intensifying. Some of them don't come back the same. I laughed it off, figuring he was just messing with me. But that night, as I closed up shop and turned off the lights, I found myself glancing over my shoulder a little more often, feeling a creeping sensation, like the aisles weren't as empty as they seemed. It wasn't until 3 days later that I got my first taste of what he meant. It was late, maybe 10:30 p.m., and I was stocking the back shelf, trying to keep my head down. I'd had a bad day. Found out my girlfriend back home had been seeing someone else, and I was in that kind of angry, exhausted mood where every little sound grated on my nerves. The hum of the lights overhead seemed louder than usual, almost oppressive, and there was this weird, stale smell hanging in the air, like cardboard left out in the rain. I went to grab a can of soup from the storage box, and as I straightened up, I noticed something strange. The aisles didn't look right. They were longer, way longer. The entire store seemed to have stretched somehow, extending into a weird, dim hallway that I knew shouldn't exist. I turned back toward the door, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, but the front counter was gone. All I saw were aisles stretching out in every direction, walls lined with shelves that seemed to go on forever. My mouth went dry, my stomach twisting. I tried to retrace my steps, stepping back the way I'd come, but the aisles kept shifting. Every time I turned a corner, I found myself somewhere I didn't recognize. Row after row of dust-covered shelves stacked with items I'd never seen before. One shelf was filled with old rotary phones, all identical, their cords neatly coiled, as if waiting for a call. The next was full of empty glass jars with rusted lids. I moved forward, turning another corner, and found myself staring at shelves filled with old picture frames. Each one held a photo of a different person, a woman in an old-fashioned dress, a man in a dusty bowler hat, a child with an unsettling grin. Every face looked familiar in a way that made my skin crawl, like I'd seen them somewhere before. I backed away, nearly tripping over my own feet, heart pounding. My uncle's words echoed in my head. "It's only there when it wants to be." I took a shaky breath and forced myself to keep going, ignoring the way the fluorescent lights flickered and buzzed overhead. Every step felt heavier, like the air itself was pressing down on me. And then I heard a voice. "Lost are we?" it whispered, faint and mocking, echoing off the walls. I froze, glancing around, but there was no one in sight. The voice sounded as if it were coming from just around the corner, and without thinking, I started toward it. I don't know why. Maybe I thought someone else was stuck here too. I turned the corner and nearly screamed. There, standing in the middle of the aisle, was a man. He was tall, rail-thin, dressed in clothes that looked like they'd been pulled out of a black and white movie. His skin was pale, almost waxy, and his eyes, they were blank, like polished marbles, reflecting the fluorescent light back at me. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice smooth and emotionless. "Not everyone who wanders and gets to wander back out." I opened my mouth to respond, but my voice caught in my throat. He tilted his head, watching me with a small, amused smile, as if waiting to see what I'd do. Then, just as suddenly as he'd appeared, he turned and walked down the aisle, disappearing around the next corner. I didn't think. I just followed, desperate to find my way out, convinced he knew the way. I chased him around one aisle, then another, my footsteps echoing in the silence. But every time I turned a corner, he was just out of reach, his figure flickering like a bad TV signal. Finally, I stopped, gasping for breath, heart hammering in my chest. I was alone again, surrounded by rows of canned goods and dusty shelves. I took a step back, dizzy and disoriented, and that's when I noticed the labels. They weren't brands. Each can had a date printed on it, some going back decades, others only a few years old. I picked one up, squinting at the label. It read June 17th, 1968. The next one read September 5th, 1973. They were all dates, dozens of them, lining the shelves like a twisted archive. A thought crept into my mind, a realization that made my blood run cold. These dates, they weren't random. They were people, moments, memories, somehow cataloged and left to rot in this endless maze. I turned and ran, my only goal to get out, but the aisle seemed to shift with every step, stretching, curving, leading me deeper into the labyrinth. I called out, screaming for help, but my voice came back to me in mocking whispers, distorted, twisted into something that wasn't my own. Finally, after what felt like hours, I stumbled into an open area, a dead end surrounded by shelves. At the center of the space was a single object, a mirror, cracked and dusty, propped against the wall. I stepped closer, drawn to it, half hoping to see a way out in the reflection. But what I saw wasn't my own face. Instead, I saw the man again, standing just behind me, his empty eyes staring over my shoulder. He raised a hand, placing it against the glass, his fingers spreading as if he were feeling the surface between us. Then, slowly, he smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched too far, splitting his face like a mask. I stumbled back, horrified, but the figure in the mirror didn't move. Instead, he raised a finger to his lips and whispered, "Shh." I turned and bolted, running blindly through the aisles until, suddenly, I was out. The familiar sight of the front counter, the aisles in their normal order, the dim streetlight filtering through the windows. It all greeted me like a punch to the gut. I staggered out of the store, slamming the door behind me, breathing in the cool night air as if it were the first time I'd ever breathed at all. My uncle found me sitting on the curb hours later, silent and shaking. He didn't ask what happened. He just put a hand on my shoulder and said, "Some places keep pieces of the past locked up. Some don't like to be disturbed." I quit that night. I didn't care about the job or the money. But sometimes when I close my eyes, I still see that figure in the mirror, waiting, watching, with that empty, stretching grin. And every so often, I'll hear a faint whisper, like it's calling me back, inviting me to wander through those endless aisles one last time. It was the kind of moment that, at first, doesn't even register as strange. I was at my usual coffee shop, just down the street from my apartment, a cozy, slightly cluttered place where every table is different, and the chairs don't quite match. I'd been coming here for years, sitting by the window, watching the world pass by while I worked or read, and I always saw the same regulars. That day was no different, or so I thought. I'd ordered my usual black coffee, and when I picked it up from the counter, I noticed the barista had given me a polite, familiar smile. She was an older woman with silver hair, pulled back in a bun, the kind of person who remembered all the regulars' orders. I returned the smile, mumbling a quick thanks, and made my way to my favorite spot by the window. I'd only been sitting there a few minutes when I looked up and saw the same barista at the counter. Only now she was looking slightly confused, scanning the cafe as if she didn't recognize it. I raised a brow, thinking maybe I'd mistaken her for someone else. But then I watched her as she walked to the register, put on an apron, the same one she'd been wearing moments earlier, and took an order from a customer like she was starting her shift. The coffee cup in my hand felt strangely heavy. I glanced down at it, half expecting it to disappear, but it was still there, warm and full. I tried to shake it off, chalk it up to a lack of sleep, but something about the scene felt fragile. I was staring at her, watching her every move, until she caught me looking and gave me that same polite smile, exactly like the one she'd given me moments before. The smile was familiar, comfortable, and completely out of place. I turned back to my laptop, but I couldn't focus. It felt like the room itself was leaning, just slightly, as if everything were bending inward. Then, as I looked around, I saw them. More regulars I knew well, all sitting in the same seats they usually sat in at the same tables, with the same expressions on their faces, holding the same cups, all with that polite, friendly barista smile. Their heads were all just slightly tilted toward me, staring at me without really looking. I closed my laptop, ready to leave. But as I stood, I heard a voice from the counter call my name, friendly, but with an edge that set my teeth on edge. I looked back, and there was the barista again, her face blank, her eyes fixed on me. "Forgetting something?" she asked, holding out a cup identical to the one already in my hand. I glanced down, and sure enough, I was still holding my coffee. No, I'm good," I stammered, backing toward the door. Her eyes didn't follow me. They just stayed glued to the place where I'd been sitting. The air outside felt thick, and I could feel a strange pressure behind my eyes, like I'd stayed up too late staring at a screen. The street looked normal, filled with familiar sights, but everything was just slightly off. The people on the sidewalk moved like they were on a conveyor belt, all with an unnerving, synchronized rhythm. And then, to my surprise, I caught sight of a woman in a red coat walking toward me. She looked like someone I'd seen 100 times on the morning commute. Long brown hair, glasses, a worn leather bag slung over her shoulder. The problem was, I'd just seen her walk past me in the other direction. I stopped, watching her as she walked by. She didn't look at me, didn't notice me at all, just kept her head down, eyes on the sidewalk exactly like before. I turned to watch her, and as she rounded the corner, a cold chill settled in my stomach. Maybe it was the stress of work, the sleep deprivation, or maybe even just an odd coincidence, I told myself. Still, I couldn't shake the strange sense of dread that something wasn't right. I headed home, thinking a nap might help, but the walk back felt heavy, as if I was wading through some invisible current. Once I got home, things only got weirder. As I closed the door behind me, I felt an unusual pressure, like the room itself was holding its breath. The apartment felt smaller somehow, like the walls were pressing in just slightly. I tossed my keys onto the kitchen counter, and they landed with a sharp clink, and then, a moment later, I heard the exact same clink, even louder, as if someone had dropped another set of keys right beside me. I stared at the counter, my heart pounding. There was nothing there, but when I glanced down at the floor, I saw my keys resting by my feet. I picked them up, confusion and panic starting to creep in. Hadn't I just dropped them on the counter? Was I losing it? I placed the keys on the counter again, slowly this time, making sure they were secure. I turned away, only to hear that same metallic clink behind me again. I didn't check the counter this time. I was too scared to look. I stumbled backward, turning to head into my bedroom, trying to calm my racing thoughts, telling myself that maybe it was just nerves, that I'd been overworking myself. But the second I stepped into my room, my blood went cold. There, lying neatly in the middle of my bed, was my laptop, still open, showing the email I'd been drafting at the cafe. I could feel my pulse throbbing in my temples. I hadn't taken my laptop out of my bag since I'd left the coffee shop. I picked it up cautiously, flipping it shut, half expecting it to snap open again. I threw it back in my bag and decided I needed to get out of the apartment, clear my head, feel the air outside, anything to ground me. But when I stepped back out into the hall, my hand froze on the doorknob. The hallway was dark. All the lights had gone out, leaving only dim, slatted shadows from the afternoon sun streaming in through the windows. I walked down the hall, each step echoing unnaturally loud, until I reached the stairwell. And there at the bottom of the stairs was a figure just standing there motionless. I squinted, trying to make out their face, but all I could see was a vague silhouette. I turned to go back to my apartment, but when I looked down the hall, I realized my apartment door was open, even though I was sure I'd shut it behind me. I turned back to the figure in the stairwell, but they were gone. A shiver crawled up my spine. Slowly, I crept back down the hall to my apartment, peering around the doorframe. My laptop was sitting open again on the kitchen counter, even though I'd zipped it securely in my bag. And on the screen was an email draft with no subject line addressed to me. I felt a wave of dread as I read the message. It's all slipping, isn't it? Like you're the last one left, holding everything together. Don't let go. I backed away, my hands trembling. The air in the apartment felt thick, heavy, pressing in on me like a weight I couldn't lift. I didn't remember typing that message. I didn't remember opening the laptop. I backed toward the door, never taking my eyes off the screen. And then my phone buzzed. With a shaking hand, I pulled it out and looked at the notification. It was from myself, a text that I hadn't sent, time-stamped just moments before. Go back. You forgot something. I felt my hands go cold. I looked back at the kitchen counter, where the text had left the draft up, still open. I moved toward it slowly, as if under a spell, and just as my fingers reached for the keyboard, the screen blinked out. And in that moment, the entire room seemed to ripple, like I was seeing it through a warped glass. I blinked, and I was back at the cafe, sitting in my usual spot by the window, staring at my untouched coffee. The barista was standing at the counter, watching me with that polite, familiar smile. She nodded like we shared a secret. I felt disoriented, like I'd just woken up from a deep sleep, but everything around me looked exactly as it had before. Same coffee cup, same view of the street, same hum of chatter and clinking cups around me. But as I looked at the people nearby, I noticed they were all watching me. Not directly, but from the corners of their eyes, like they were waiting for me to slip, to lose my grip on the thin veneer of reality. I reached for my coffee, and when I lifted the cup, it was cold. It started with a box. I'd just gotten back from my shift and was dragging myself up the 3 flights of stairs to my apartment when I noticed it, an old, battered box sitting outside my door. No name, no return address, just a cardboard box with the flaps half torn open like it had been dropped. I nudged it with my foot. It felt heavy, like something solid was inside, and for a second, I wondered if it was some weird late-night delivery. But I hadn't ordered anything. I brought it inside, figuring I'd take a look and maybe contact the building manager. But as I set it down, I felt a strange sense of unease, like there was something about the box I shouldn't be messing with. The whole thing was taped up with what looked like thick black duct tape, wrinkled and patchy like someone had been in a hurry to seal it shut. My gut told me to leave it alone, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my keys, sliced through the tape, and pried the flaps open. Inside, there was a single item, an old, bulky VHS tape with a strip of masking tape across the front that read, in thick black letters, "Watch me." Weird. I hadn't seen a VHS tape in years, let alone one just randomly delivered to my door. I sat back, staring at the tape, wondering if it was some sort of prank. Then I remembered. My apartment actually came with an old VHS player tucked in the back of the cabinet beneath my TV. I'd never bothered to use it, but apparently the last tenant had left it behind. I figured, what the hell? I hooked up the player, slid the tape in, and hit play. At first, it was just static, the grainy black and white snow of a worn-out tape. But after a few seconds, the screen flickered and an image appeared. It was my apartment building, but from a strange angle, like it had been recorded through a long-distance lens, or maybe through a crack in a doorway. The camera slowly panned up floor by floor until it stopped outside my window. I leaned forward, feeling an odd mix of fascination and dread. The view zoomed in on my window, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, there was a faint rustling sound from the tape, and something shifted in the dark. I couldn't make it out at first, but as my eyes adjusted, I could just barely make out a figure, a person standing in my window, their face pressed to the glass, staring in. The figure was watching me. The footage continued for a few more seconds before cutting to black, leaving me sitting there, heart racing. I told myself it was just some creepy recording from the last tenant or a prank someone had sent me, but I felt an urge to look behind me, to check my window, just to be sure. I stood up and went to the window, my hands shaking, but there was nothing there, just the empty night, the faint hum of streetlights below. The next morning, I put the box outside, hoping that whoever left it would just take it back. But when I got home, it was there again, waiting by my door. I picked it up, took it inside, and despite every part of me screaming that I shouldn't, I played the tape again. This time, the footage was from inside my apartment. The view was shaky, moving slowly through my living room, into the kitchen, and then down the narrow hallway towards my bedroom. I felt cold as I watched it, my mind struggling to piece together how anyone could have gotten this footage. It looked recent. My coffee cup was sitting on the counter, a book was open on the table, and every detail was exactly as I'd left it that morning. The camera moved closer to my bedroom door, pausing just outside. I wanted to stop the tape, but I was frozen, unable to look away. The door slowly opened, and the camera pushed into the room. The bed was empty. I wasn't there, thank God, but the camera lingered on the sheets as if looking for something. Then, from behind the camera, I heard it. My own voice. "Who's there?" I asked, sounding groggy, like I'd just woken up. The camera whirled around, and I saw myself standing in the doorway, rubbing my eyes, squinting into the dark. The screen went black, and the tape ended. I hit rewind, my heart racing, but when I tried to play it again, all I got was static. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I barely slept, convinced that if I closed my eyes, I'd open them to find someone standing over me. I started locking the door, checking the windows, and double-checking that everything was secure before I went to bed. I even thought about telling someone, maybe the building manager or the police, but what would I say? Someone left me a tape of myself, filmed from inside my own apartment? They'd think I was crazy. Then, 2 nights later, I woke up to the sound of the tape player. It was turning on by itself, the TV flickering to life, static filling the room. I sat up, heart pounding, watching as the player clicked, and the tape began to play. I tried to stop it, but the buttons wouldn't respond. I could only watch, helpless, as the footage began. This time it showed my bedroom again, but now the camera was close to the bed, hovering just over my sleeping form. My chest rose and fell with each breath, the sound of my own breathing loud and steady. I watched, horrified, as the camera moved closer, panning down to my face. Then slowly it reached out a gloved hand, toward my cheek, hovering just above my skin. My own face twisted on the screen, as if sensing something, but I didn't wake up. I slammed the power button, but the TV wouldn't turn off. The hand moved lower, brushing a strand of hair from my face as I slept. I could feel it, almost like a memory, a ghost of a touch on my skin. My heart was pounding, and I could barely breathe. Then, just as the camera pulled back, the screen cut to black. The room went silent. My hand shook as I reached for the remote, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what I'd just seen. I wanted to believe it was a nightmare, some twisted hallucination, but the lingering sensation on my cheek felt too real. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up, watching the shadows crawl across the walls, every noise sending a jolt of fear through me. In the morning, I packed a bag, grabbed the box, and went straight to the nearest dumpster, tossing the tape inside and walking away without looking back. I spent the day out, killing time at a coffee shop, trying to convince myself it was over. But when I got home that evening, there was the box sitting outside my door like it had never left. I didn't open it. I moved out the next day, breaking my lease and leaving behind almost everything I owned. I didn't care about the cost, didn't care about the hassle. I just wanted out. It's been weeks now, and I haven't gone back. But every so often, I feel a familiar chill, a sense that something is watching me. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the faint hum of static, and I wonder if I'll wake up to find that tape again, waiting for me like it always had. The first time it happened, I thought I'd simply been mistaken. I was unlocking my front door after work, my keys heavy in my hand, when I looked up and saw my apartment door already slightly ajar. For a moment, I froze, and then a thought crept into my mind. Maybe I'd forgotten to lock it that morning. Maybe I'd been so lost in the day's plans that I'd rushed out, leaving it unlocked. But I knew I hadn't. I'd locked it. I remembered the precise twist of the key in my hand. I nudged the door open and peered inside. Nothing seemed out of place. Shoes were lined up by the entryway. My coat hung on its usual hook. It looked exactly as I'd left it. I walked in cautiously, half expecting some stranger to be lurking in the corners, but no one was there. I chalked it up to a fluke, maybe a faulty latch, and locked up as usual. But the strange, unsettled feeling hung around for days. Then it started happening more often. Some mornings, I'd leave my keys on the kitchen counter, only to come back in the evening and find them on the dining table. Books I'd left on the couch would reappear on the bookshelf, neatly aligned with the spines facing out. Every few days, I'd wake up to find the television remote on the floor by the door, like someone had dropped it on their way out. It didn't feel sinister, exactly, but it felt calculated, like a strange puzzle I was meant to solve but didn't have enough pieces to understand. I considered getting a camera to record the nights, but part of me was terrified of what I'd see. The turning point came one night when I woke up to a strange noise. It was just past 3 in the morning, and the apartment was dark and still. I'd heard something faint but unmistakable, a rustling sound, like paper being turned over and over. I sat up slowly, my heart pounding, and listened as it came again, rustle, pause, rustle. I crept out of bed, careful to avoid the creaky spot near my dresser, and peered into the living room. In the faint light from the street lamps outside, I could just barely make out a figure standing by my coffee table, leaning over a stack of papers. I was too scared to move, my body half frozen, my mind racing. And then I saw her face. My own face. It was like looking into a mirror, but not quite. This woman had my features, but they were sharper, almost more focused. She wore the same pajamas I was wearing, down to the mismatched socks. She looked up, met my gaze, and raised a finger to her lips, signaling for silence. A strange calm washed over me, drowning out the terror. I wanted to scream or demand answers, but she simply walked past me, moving with the confidence of someone who belonged here. She slipped into the hallway, leaving me standing there alone, my mind struggling to catch up with the absurdity of what I'd just seen. After that night, the feeling of being a stranger in my own life grew. Small routines began to take on a surreal quality, as if I was mimicking someone else's actions. When I'd brush my teeth, I'd see her in the mirror behind me for a split second, always turning away before I could get a good look. I'd hear footsteps that echoed my own in empty rooms. Sometimes, I'd even catch the scent of my own perfume, only I hadn't worn any that day. One morning, I walked into my living room to find a notebook on the coffee table. It was worn, the cover frayed, and my initials were scrawled across the front in my own handwriting. I hadn't left it there, hadn't seen it before in my life. I opened it, flipping through pages filled with entries, all in my handwriting. November 3rd, woke up at 6:30, saw her reflection in the window. She was watching me from across the street. November 10th, remote moved again. Saw her at work this time, passing by my desk like she'd been there for years. November 17th, she left the door open again. Tried to confront her. She won't answer me. Page after page, a series of events that were all too familiar, yet unfamiliar. All the strange things I'd noticed and things I hadn't, different versions of my life, recorded in shaky pen. Then, halfway through the book, the entries changed. They were no longer just notes about her appearances. They were messages. It's time to start noticing. Do you really think this is your life? Look closer. This was never your home. I stared at the words, my pulse racing. I flipped through the remaining pages, but they were blank. I sat there, gripping the notebook, feeling a chill spread through me. Over the next few days, I tried to go about my life, but every familiar place felt like a stage set designed to look like my world. The grocery store, the library, even my own office. I'd walk in and feel eyes on me like I'd stumbled into the wrong place by mistake. It was a week later when I saw her again, clearer this time. She was in my kitchen, calmly pouring a cup of coffee, acting as if she belonged there. I didn't flinch this time. I walked right up to her, close enough to smell the faint, familiar scent of my own soap. "Who are you?" I demanded, voice shaking. She looked up at me with that same strange, almost sad smile. "I'm you," she said. "The version of you that didn't get lost." "Lost? Lost where?" My mind was racing, the edges of reality blurring like a lens out of focus. She sighed, setting the cup down. "Do you really think you belong here?" She gestured around my apartment. "Look at all this. Does it feel real to you? Or do you feel like a visitor, like you're trying to convince yourself it all makes sense?" I blinked, her words cutting deeper than I wanted to admit. "This is my home," I insisted. "These are my things. I live here." But even as I said it, doubt crept in. There had been something wrong for a long time. A feeling of disconnection I tried to ignore, moments that didn't add up. She watched me, her gaze unwavering. "This place isn't yours," she said softly. "It never was. You just wandered in and convinced yourself you belonged. But you've been drifting further and further away from where you're supposed to be." Her words echoed in my mind, stirring something deep, a memory or a dream I couldn't fully grasp. "Then where am I supposed to be?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. She took my hand, her grip steady, and guided me to the mirror. She pointed at our reflections, side by side, identical yet distinct. "Somewhere on the other side," she said, "where you've always been, watching." I stared at our reflections, feeling the weight of a life I couldn't remember, yet somehow knew. It was like looking through the surface of a pond, seeing shapes moving below the surface, knowing there was something deeper if I could just reach it. "Will I remember?" I asked, feeling a strange pull like I was about to let go of something vital. She squeezed my hand. "You already do," she said. And with that, she was gone. I stood there, staring at my reflection, but this time it didn't feel like mine. It was a face I recognized, but from a distance, a life I'd borrowed but never fully inhabited. I took a deep breath and felt a strange clarity wash over me, as if I'd been carrying a weight that wasn't mine. Now, I drift through the familiar spaces, feeling like a ghost in my own life, sensing the presence of others just out of sight. Sometimes, in mirrors or in half-silver glass, I catch glimpses of her, or maybe myself. We watch each other, waiting for the right moment to cross back, to find our way home. But now, I'm no longer afraid, because I know somewhere there's a version of me who's been waiting, someone who remembers all the things I've forgotten, just as I remember for it. I've never really believed in anything supernatural, but something happened a few years ago that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. I haven't told many people because, frankly, it sounds absurd, but it stayed with me in a way that's hard to explain. I was working as a night guard at a little museum in my hometown. It wasn't the grand, old kind of museum you'd expect, with towering dinosaur bones or priceless art. It was small and a little rundown, a mix of local history and oddities from around the area. I thought it would be an easy job, but then, well, things got weird. My shifts were from midnight to 6 in the morning, and usually nothing happened. It was quiet, almost too quiet, and the halls always had that cold, stale smell that never quite went away, no matter how often they were cleaned. I'd walk the halls every hour, check the security monitors, and pass the time by listening to podcasts or reading on my phone. After a few weeks, the place felt almost familiar, like a second home. Until one night, that is, when I started noticing things that didn't add up. It started with a mannequin. In one of the exhibits, there was a life-size mannequin dressed in old 1800s clothing, meant to depict a settler from the area. She had a bonnet, a faded dress, and a blank, eerie expression, with eyes that seemed too glassy for plastic. One night, I was doing my rounds and noticed that she was facing a different direction. She usually faced straight out toward the hallway, but now she was turned slightly to the left, almost as if she were looking over her shoulder. I laughed it off, assuming it was my imagination, or that maybe the cleaning staff had knocked her when they tidied up. But the next night, she'd shifted again, this time more noticeably, her head tilted down like she was looking at her feet. I checked the security cameras, but they showed nothing out of the ordinary. And yet, every night, I'd find her in a different position, as if she were gradually turning away from me, moving bit by bit. By the end of the week, she was facing the wall entirely, and I felt a knot of dread in my stomach every time I walked past. One night, I mentioned it to a coworker who worked the day shift, hoping they'd confirm it was just a prank. They gave me a strange look, almost like they were expecting me to bring it up, and told me that the mannequin had been there for years. They said it had been donated by a local woman who'd found it in her attic. Apparently, no one knew where it had come from, and the woman didn't even remember ever buying it. She claimed she'd just found it one day, standing at the top of her staircase. The way they told the story, it sounded like an old town legend, something people shared around Halloween. But the day shifter got quiet, then added, "That mannequin has always freaked people out. You wouldn't be the first to notice it moving." They left it at that, and I felt this creeping unease start to settle over me. I told myself it was just a story, something to keep the new guy on edge. But things didn't stop with the mannequin. A few days later, I was walking through the small oddities section, where they kept random relics from the town's early days. A strange wooden box, a cracked mirror, a rusty old pair of scissors that looked more like they belonged in a horror movie than a museum. I'd passed through this room countless times, but that night, as I turned my flashlight toward the corner, I saw a dark stain on the floor near the base of the cracked mirror. It looked fresh, almost like wet ink or oil. The smell was awful, metallic and sour. I'd never seen it before, and it was thick, smeared as though someone had dragged their hand through it. I thought maybe a pipe had burst, but when I went to find a mop, the stain was gone. I touched the floor, half expecting it to be wet, but it was dry, smooth, like nothing had been there at all. I was getting spooked, but I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. Instead, I tried to go about my night as usual, keeping an eye on the mannequin every time I passed her, even though I tried not to. The last round of the night came at 5 a.m., and I was almost through it when I realized I hadn't seen the mannequin at all. I stopped in my tracks, suddenly wide awake. She was gone. I felt a chill run through me as I stood there, staring at the empty spot where she should have been. I circled the entire exhibit, but she was nowhere in sight. Panic started to settle in as I thought of the security cameras. Maybe someone had broken in and taken her as a prank, or worse. I rushed back to the security office and rewound the footage. At first, it looked normal, though she was standing perfectly still. I watched it frame by frame, thinking I'd catch someone coming in. But as I played through the footage, I felt my heart skip. There was no one in the footage. She didn't leave. She simply faded, almost like static, her shape distorting until she vanished, right in front of the camera. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the empty screen, but eventually, I forced myself to finish my shift, waiting anxiously for the day shift guard to arrive. I kept telling myself I'd imagined it, that there was some logical explanation, that I was just sleep-deprived. I didn't return that night. I called in sick, hoping some distance would help me shake the feeling that I'd seen something I wasn't meant to see. But the following night, I got a text from my day shift coworker. It was just a single sentence. "You need to see the mannequin." Against my better judgment, I went back to the museum. The day shift guard was waiting for me in the lobby, looking pale. He didn't say anything, just led me to the exhibit room where the mannequin was back in her usual spot. But she'd changed. Her face, which had always been blank and expressionless, was now twisted, as though molded into a slight, mocking smile. And her hand was raised, almost as if she were reaching out to someone, her fingers stretched toward the edge of her bonnet. When I saw that, my blood went cold. I told myself the mannequin had always looked that way, that I must have just forgotten the details. But every time I turned away, I felt her eyes on me. I tried to leave, but the guard stopped me, his face dead serious. I was driving home late one night after a weekend trip with friends, feeling that cozy sort of fatigue where you're bone-tired but happy. My phone had died hours ago, so I've been singing along to old CDs to keep myself awake, the car rocking along empty back roads. Just me, the open highway, and the stars overhead. I'd driven this route a dozen times, but that night, things felt different. The trees pressed in close, looming tall and dark on either side, and the road seemed narrower than I remembered, winding like a serpent under the pale moonlight. Every so often, I catch a flash of movement in my peripheral vision, animals I assumed darting across the road. It was normal for this part of the state, but there was something off about the way they moved, like shadows slipping just out of reach. Around midnight, I saw for the first time a figure standing by the side of the road, just beyond the wash of my headlights. My stomach clenched, and I felt a chill prickling the back of my neck. They wore what looked like a long, hooded cloak, their head tilted down so I couldn't see their face. I slowed down instinctively, but as soon as I blinked, the figure was gone. 1 second there, the next a patch of empty road. I laughed nervously, telling myself it was just my imagination. Sleep deprivation, maybe, but the road continued to wind, and the trees seemed to close in tighter. I cranked the window down, hoping the cold air would help me stay alert. Then I caught it in my rearview mirror, the same figure standing in the middle of the road, far behind me, getting smaller as I drove. I felt a knot of fear tighten in my chest, but I forced myself to keep my eyes on the road, telling myself it wasn't real. But then, it happened again. Just a few minutes later, as I rounded a bend, I saw the figure standing there on the shoulder, closer now. This time, I didn't slow down. I kept my eyes straight ahead, gripping the wheel, my mind racing. Had I seen a face? I couldn't remember, and as I sped past, I felt certain that if I looked back, I'd see them standing in the middle of the road again, watching. I kept driving, faster now, my pulse racing, trying to shake off the strange fear gnawing at my stomach. But as I drove on, the figure appeared over and over. Every mile or so, just ahead, standing by the roadside like they were waiting for me. I couldn't make out any details, just the shape of the hood, the dark outline of their cloak. Always watching. Panic gripped me when I realized I was almost out of gas. There hadn't been a gas station for miles, and the fuel gauge was nearly in the red. My mind was spinning, looking for a solution, when a neon sign blinked up ahead, barely visible between the trees. Relief flooded me. I slowed down, turning into the lot. The station looked deserted, with a single flickering light casting a sickly glow over the pumps. I parked and stepped out, keeping one eye on the shadows. The air was freezing, and the smell of gasoline hung heavy. There was no attendant, just the pump and a silent convenience store with all the lights off. I was alone. I held my breath, listening to the quiet, then forced myself to focus, inserting my card and starting to fill up the tank. As the gas pumped, I glanced around nervously, half expecting to see the hooded figure somewhere in the shadows. But the lot was empty. Just me, the sound of gas sloshing into my tank, and that eerie silence pressing in from the trees. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible. It sounded like someone saying my name, a low, dragging murmur that made my skin crawl. I spun around, but no one was there. The whisper came again, closer this time, though I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It was like the sound was in the air itself, weaving through the night. My heart pounded, my eyes searching the darkness. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. The figure was there, just beyond the circle of light from the pump, standing at the edge of the lot, motionless and silent. I froze, staring, half expecting them to vanish again. But this time, they didn't. They took a single step forward, slow and deliberate, their face still hidden under the hood. I bolted from my car, slamming the nozzle back into the pump, not even waiting to cap the tank. I jumped in, locked the doors, and floored the gas. Gravel sprayed as I tore out of the lot, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. I didn't want to know if they were following. For miles, I drove as fast as I could, heart hammering, every shadow along the road looking like that cloaked figure. Eventually, the road straightened out, the trees thinned, and a distant, hazy light marked the edges of a small town. I slowed down, my pulse gradually calming as the first signs of civilization appeared. Streetlights, houses, a distant church spire. The sense of dread began to fade, replaced by an overwhelming wave of relief. But as I turned on a main street, something made me glance at the sidewalk. My heart stuttered. There, standing under one of the streetlights, was the figure in the cloak. This time, they were facing me. I could just barely make out a pale face under the hood, but their features were blurred, wrong, like a picture out of focus. I sped up, trying to shake the vision from my mind. But as I drove through town, they were everywhere, in shop windows, at street corners, standing on porches, always in that dark cloak watching. It was like a ghost town populated only by them. Every time I blinked, they were closer. My breath came in shallow gasps as I finally saw the road leading out of town. I pressed the accelerator, speeding past the last few houses. I felt a wave of nausea, convinced that when I reached the end of the road, the figure would be there, waiting. But as I flew past the last streetlight, I realized the road was open. Empty. Relief washed over me as I drove on, the lights of the town shrinking in my rearview mirror. After a few miles, I started to laugh, the sound shaky and unsteady. I'd made it. The fear began to drain away, leaving me exhausted and numb. I told myself it was all just a trick of my tired mind, a hallucination brought on by the long drive, the darkness, and the isolation. But just as I was settling back, I noticed something strange about the road ahead. I was back on that same winding, tree-lined stretch from earlier, the one where I'd first seen the figure. My laughter died in my throat, replaced by a sick, creeping dread. I hadn't turned around. I hadn't taken any exits. But somehow, I was back on that road, and the trees seemed closer than ever, leaning in as if to swallow me whole. My hands tightened on the wheel as I looked around, trying to figure out what had happened. That's when I saw the gas station up ahead, the flickering neon sign casting an eerie glow over the pumps. I was back where I'd started. The figure was waiting there. Standing by the pumps, their hood lifted just enough to reveal a twisted, knowing smile. I slammed the brakes, throwing the car into reverse, heart pounding as I tried to back away. But the road behind me stretched on, longer and darker than before, an endless, twisting path with no end in sight. I looked back toward the gas station, and the figure was closer, drifting toward me, their form hazy and indistinct, as though they were more shadow than flesh. A cold sweat prickled down my spine as the whisper returned, louder this time, filling the car like a thick fog. "You can't leave," it murmured, the words slipping into my ears, winding into my thoughts. "This road only goes one way." The last thing I remember is that smile, spreading wide under the hood, impossibly dark eyes shining with something ancient and hungry. And then the lights went out. The headlights, the street lights, even the stars disappeared, leaving me in an empty, endless darkness. I don't know how long I've been here, driving this same road. Sometimes I catch glimpses of other people, just on the edges of my vision. I think they're trapped here too, lost in the endless night. And every so often, I see that figure waiting by the road, always watching, always smiling, as if they're waiting for me to finally understand why I'm here. But the truth is, I don't remember anymore. I don't remember where I was going or who I was. All I know is this road and the darkness and the figure in the cloak who watches me as I drive into the endless night.